Chapter 10 of the Life of Washington, Volume 2, by John Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Inquiry into the conduct of General Schuyler. Burgoyne appears before Ticonderoga. Evacuation of that place. Of Gainsborough. Colonel Warner defeated. Evacuation of Fort Anne. Proclamation of Burgoyne. Counter proclamation of Schuyler. Burgoyne approaches Fort Edward. Schuyler retires to Saratoga, to Stillwater. St-Leger invests Fort Schuyler. Herkimer defeated. Colonel Baum, detached to Bennington, is defeated. Breckman defeated. St-Leger abandons the siege of Fort Schuyler. Murder of Miss McCrae. General Gates takes command. Burgoyne encamps on the heights of Saratoga. Battle of Stillwater. Burgoyne retreats to Saratoga. Capitulates. The British take forts Montgomery and Clinton. The forts Independence and Constitution evacuated by the Americans. Ticonderoga evacuated by the British. 1777. While with inferior numbers, General Washington maintained a stubborn contest in the Middle States. Events of great variety and importance were passing in the North. After Sir Guy Carleton had distributed his army for winter quarters in the several villages from the Ile aux Noix and Montreal to Quebec, General Burgoyne, who had served under him, embarked for England in order to communicate a full statement of affairs in the Northern Department and to assist in making arrangements for the ensuing campaign. The American army, having been formed for only 1 year, dissolved of itself at the expiration of that term, and could scarcely furnish even the appearance of garrisons in their forts. The defense of this frontier was assigned to the regiments directed to be raised in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and the northwestern parts of New York. But the recruiting service advanced so slowly, and so much difficulty was found in clothing and arming those who were enlisted, that it became indispensable to call in the aid of the militia, and the plan of the campaign on the part of the British was involved in so much obscurity that General Washington deemed it advisable to direct 8 of the regiments of Massachusetts to rendezvous at Peekskill. An inquiry into the conduct of General Schuyler, which terminates to his honor. May 22. The service of General Schuyler in the Northern Department had been more solid than brilliant. Dissatisfied with his situation and disgusted with the injustice he supposed himself to experience, he had for some time meditated a resignation, and had been retained in the service only by the deep interest he felt in the struggle of his country for independence. So soon as his fears for Ticonderoga were removed by the partial opening of Lake Champlain, he waited in person on Congress for the purpose of adjusting his accounts, obtaining an inquiry into his conduct, and supporting those necessary measures of defense in the North which were suggested by his perfect knowledge of the country. At his request, a committee consisting of a member from each state was appointed to inquire into his conduct during the time he had held a command in the army. The arduous services performed by this meritorious officer, when investigated, were found so far to exceed any estimate which had been made of them, that Congress deemed it essential to the public interest to prevail on him to retain his commission. The resolution which fixed his headquarters at Albany was repealed, and he was directed to proceed forthwith to the Northern Department and to take the command of it. On his arrival, he found the Army of the North not only too weak for the objects entrusted to it, but badly supplied with arms, clothes, and provisions. From a spy who had been seized near Onion River, he obtained information that General Burgoyne was at Quebec and was to command the British forces in that department so soon as they should march out of Canada, that while Ticonderoga should be attacked by the main army, Sir John Johnson, with a strong body of British, Canadians, and Indians, was to penetrate to the Mohawk by Oswego and place himself between Fort Stanwix and Fort Edward. Burgoyne appears before Ticonderoga. General Schuyler was sensible of the danger which threatened him, and made every exertion to meet it. After completing his arrangements at Ticonderoga for sustaining a siege, he had proceeded to Albany for the purpose of attending to his supplies and of expediting the march of reinforcements, when he received intelligence from General St. Clair, who was entrusted with the defense of Ticonderoga, that Burgoyne had appeared before that place. In the course of the preceding winter, a plan for penetrating to the Hudson from Canada by the way of the lakes had been digested in the cabinet of London. General Burgoyne, who assisted in forming it, was entrusted with its execution, and was to lead a formidable army against Ticonderoga as soon as the season would permit. At the same time, a smaller party under Colonel St. Leger, composed of Canadians, newly raised Americans, and a few Europeans, aided by a powerful body of Indians, was to march from Oswego to enter the country by the way of the Mohawk and to join the Grand Army on the Hudson. January 22, Burgoyne reached Quebec as soon as it was practicable to sail up the St. Lawrence, and appeared in full force on the river Bouquet on the western banks of Lake Champlain much earlier than the American general had supposed to be possible. At this place he met the Indians in a grand council, after which he gave them a war feast. Much of the cruelty afterwards perpetrated by the savages has been attributed to this unfortunate officer, but justice requires the admission that his speech was calculated rather to diminish than increase their habitual ferocity. He endeavored to impress on them the distinction between enemies in the field and the unarmed inhabitants, many of whom were friends, and addressing himself to their avarice, promised rewards for prisoners, but none for scalps. It was perhaps fortunate for America that in some instances, peculiarly calculated to excite and interest the human feelings, these feeble restraints were disregarded. After publishing a manifesto at Putnam River, designed to act on the hopes and fears of the people of the country through which he was to pass, he halted a few days at Crown Point to make the necessary dispositions for investing Ticonderoga. June 30, from Crown Point, the Royal Army advanced on both sides the lake, keeping up a communication between its divisions by means of the fleet, and on the 1st of July encamped within 4 miles of the American works. A strong party was pushed forward to 3 Mile Point, and the fleet anchored just beyond the range of the guns of the fort. July 1, the next day, they took possession, without opposition, of the important post at Mount Hope, which commanded in part the lines on the northern side and entirely cut off the communication with Lake George. The weakness of his garrison induced General St. Clair to give up this post without a struggle. Believing it to be impracticable to support it without hazarding a general action, he determined to concentrate his force about Ticonderoga and Mount Independence. After taking possession of Mount Hope, the British lines were extended to the western side of Champlain, from the mountain quite to the lake, so as completely to enclose the garrison on that side. The German division under Major General Riedesel, which occupied the eastern shore of the lake, was encamped at 3 Mile Point and had pushed forward a detachment near the rivulet, which runs east of Mount Independence. July. The besiegers labored assiduously to bring up their artillery and complete their works. Sugar Hill, a rugged mountain standing at the confluence of the waters that unite at Ticonderoga, which overlooks the fortress and had been thought inaccessible, was examined, and the report being that the ascent, though extremely difficult, was practicable, the work was immediately commenced and was pressed with so much vigor that the batteries might have opened next day. The garrison was not in a condition to check these operations. The situation of St. Clair was now at its crisis. Only the ground between the eastern run and the South River remained open, and this, he was informed, would be occupied the next day, so that the investment would be complete. The place must be immediately evacuated or maintained at the hazard of losing the garrison when it should be no longer tenable. Between these cruel alternations, General St. Clair did not hesitate to choose the first, but deeming it prudent to take the advice of a council of war, he convened the general officers, who unanimously advised the immediate evacuation of the fort, evacuation of Ticonderoga and Mount Independence. July 5. Preparations for the retreat were instantly commenced. The invalids, the hospital, and such stores as could be moved in the course of the night were put on board the bateau, which proceeded under the guard of Colonel Long up the South River to Skenesborough, and before day on the morning of the 6th of July, the main body of the army directed its march to the same place. In the hope of making considerable progress before his retreat should be discovered, General St. Clair had ordered the troops to observe the most profound silence, and particularly to set nothing on fire. These judicious orders were disobeyed, and before the rear guard was in motion, the house which had been occupied by General de Fourmoy was in flames. This served as a signal to the besiegers, who immediately entered the works. The main body of the retreating army was rapidly pursued by Generals Fraser and Riedesel, while General Burgoyne in person followed the detachment under Colonel Long. July 6, the bridge, the boom, and those other works, the construction of which had employed the labor of 10 months, were cut through by 9 in the morning, so as to afford a passage for the Royal George and Inflexible frigates, as well as for the gunboats which engaged the American galleys about 3 in the afternoon near the falls of Skenesborough. The American army evacuate Skenesborough and retire to Fort Anne. In the meantime, 3 regiments had disembarked at some distance from the fort, with the intention of attacking it by land and cutting off the retreat of the garrison, as well as that of the detachment in the boats and galleys. This maneuver being discovered, the works and bateaux were set on fire, and the troops retired to Fort Anne. On this occasion, the baggage of the army and a great quantity of military stores were either destroyed by the Americans or taken by the British. Knowing that he could save his army only by the rapidity of his march, General St. Clair reached Castletown, 30 miles from Ticonderoga, on the night succeeding the evacuation of the fort. The rear guard under Colonel Warner halted 6 miles short of that place, having been augmented by those who from excessive fatigue had fallen out of the line of march. It amounted to rather more than 1,000 men. July 7, Colonel Warner attacked by General Fraser and obliged to retreat. The next morning at 5, they were overtaken and attacked by General Fraser with 850 men. The action was warm and well contested. In its commencement, 2 regiments of militia, which lay within 2 miles of Colonel Warner, were ordered to his assistance. Instead of obeying these orders, they consulted their own safety and hastened to Castletown. Had these orders been executed, the corps which attacked Warner would probably have been cut to pieces. While the action was maintained with equal spirit on both sides, General Riedesel arrived with his division of Germans, and the Americans were routed. In this action, Colonel Francis, several other officers, and upwards of 200 men were left dead on the field, and 1 colonel, 7 captains, 10 subalterns, and 210 privates were made prisoners. Near 600 are supposed to have been wounded, many of whom must have perished in attempting to escape through the woods towards the inhabited country. The British state their own loss at 35 killed, among whom was 1 field officer and 144 wounded, including 2 majors and 5 inferior officers. It is scarcely credible, notwithstanding the difference in arms, that in a well-contested action the disparity in the killed could have been so considerable. It is the less probable as the pursuit was not of long continuance. To avoid that division of the British army which had proceeded up the North River, St. Clair changed his route and directed his march to Rutland, to which place he ordered Warner also to retire. At Rutland he fell in with several soldiers who had been separated from their corps, and 2 days afterwards at Manchester was joined by Warner with about 90 men. From this place he proceeded to Fort Edward, where he met General Schuyler. After taking possession of Skenesborough, Burgoyne had found it necessary to suspend the pursuit and to give his army refreshment. The troops were in some disorder, distinct corps were intermingled, and his detachments were far apart from each other. He determined, therefore, to halt a few days at that place in order to reassemble and arrange his army. July 7, Colonel Long evacuates Fort Anne and retires to Fort Edward. Colonel Long, having been directed to defend Fort Anne, the 9th Regiment of British, under Lieutenant Colonel Hill, had been detached against that place. It being understood that the Americans were in some force, 2 other regiments under Brigadier Powell were ordered to support the first party. Before the arrival of this reinforcement, Colonel Long attacked the 9th Regiment, and a sharp skirmish ensued in which the British kept their ground, and the advantage was claimed by both parties. Hearing that a reinforcement was approaching, Long set fire to the works at Fort Anne and retired to Fort Edward. July 7, at Stillwater, on his way to Ticonderoga, General Schuyler was informed of the evacuation of that place, and on the same day at Saratoga of the loss of the stores at Skenesborough. He had heard nothing from General St. Clair and was seriously apprehensive for that officer and his army, which after the junction of Colonel Long consisted of about 1,500 Continental troops and the same number of militia. They were dispirited by defeat, without tents, badly armed, and had lost great part of their stores and baggage. The country was generally much alarmed, and even the well-affected discovered more inclination to take care of themselves than to join the army. In this gloomy state of things, no officer could have exerted more diligence and skill than were displayed by Schuyler. Having fixed his headquarters at Fort Edward, He employed to the utmost advantage the short respite from action which Burgoyne unavoidably gave. The country between Skenesborough and Fort Edward was almost entirely unsettled, was covered with thick woods, and of a surface extremely rough, and much intersected with creeks and morasses. Wood Creek was navigable with bateaux as far as Fort Anne, and military stores of every description might be transported up it. He obstructed its navigation by sinking numerous impediments in its course, broke up the bridges, and rendered the roads impassable. He was also indefatigable in driving the livestock out of the way, and in bringing from Fort George to Fort Edward the ammunition and other military stores which had been deposited at that place. Still farther to delay the movements of the British, he posted Colonel Warner on their left flank with instructions to raise the militia in that quarter. The hope was entertained that the appearance of a respectable force threatening the flank and rear of the invading army would not only retard its advance, but would induce General Burgoyne to weaken it in order to strengthen the garrison of Ticonderoga. While thus endeavoring to obstruct the march of the enemy, Schuyler was not less attentive to the best means of strengthening his own army. Reinforcements of regular troops were earnestly solicited. The militia of New England and New York were required to take the field, and all his influence in the surrounding country was exerted to reanimate the people and to prevent their defection from the American cause. Proclamation of Burgoyne and counter-proclamation of Schuyler. While at Skenesborough, General Burgoyne issued a second proclamation summoning the people of the adjacent country to send 10 deputies from each township to meet Colonel Skeene at Castletown in order to deliberate on such measures as might still be adopted to save those who had not yet conformed to his first and submitted to the royal authority. General Schuyler, apprehending some effect from this paper, issued a counter-proclamation stating the insidious designs of the enemy, warning the inhabitants by the example of Jersey of the danger to which their yielding to this seductive proposition would expose them, and giving them the most solemn assurances that all who should send deputies to this meeting, or in any manner aid the enemy, would be considered traitors, and should suffer the utmost rigor of the law. The evacuation of Ticonderoga was a shock for which no part of the United States was prepared. Neither the strength of the invading army nor of the garrison had been understood. When therefore intelligence was received that a place on the fortifications of which much money and labor had been expended, which was considered as the key to the whole northwestern country and supposed to contain a garrison nearly equal to the invading army, had been abandoned without a siege, that an immense train of artillery and all the military stores had either fallen into the hands of the enemy or been destroyed, that the army on its retreat had been attacked, defeated, and dispersed. Astonishment pervaded all ranks of men, and the conduct of the officers was universally condemned. Congress recalled all the generals of the department and directed an inquiry into their conduct. Throughout New England especially, the most bitter aspersions were cast on them, and General Schuyler, who, from some unknown cause, had never been viewed with favor in that part of the continent, was involved in the common charge of treachery, to which this accumulation of unlooked-for calamity was generally attributed by the mass of the people. On the representations of General Washington, the recall of the officers was suspended until he should be of opinion that the service would not suffer by the measure, and on a full inquiry afterwards made into their conduct, they were acquitted of all blame. In a letter of St. Clair to the commander-in-chief stating his motives for evacuating Ticonderoga, he represented the strength of his garrison, including 900 militia who would consent to stay but a few days, at only 3,000 effective rank and file, many of whom were without bayonets. The lines required 10,000 to man them properly. He also affirmed that his supply of provisions was sufficient for only 20 days, and that the works on the Ticonderoga side were incomplete, with their flanks undefended. He justified his having failed to call in a larger reinforcement of militia by the scarcity of provisions, the supply on hand not having been procured until General Schuyler had resumed the command in the department, and attributed his not having evacuated the place in time to preserve his army and stores to the prevalent opinion that there was not a sufficient force in Canada to attempt so hardy an enterprise, and to his not being at liberty to adopt that measure but in the last necessity. A court of inquiry justified his conduct, and he retained the confidence of the commander-in-chief. On learning the distressed state of the remnant of the army, General Washington made great exertions to repair its losses and to reinforce it. The utmost industry was used to procure a supply of tents, artillery, and ammunition were forwarded from Massachusetts. The remaining troops of that state were ordered to that department, and General Lincoln, who possessed in a high degree the confidence of the New England militia, was directed to raise and command them. General Arnold, so often distinguished for his gallantry in the field, was ordered to the Northern army in the hope that his presence and reputation might reanimate the troops, and Colonel Morgan, with his corps of riflemen, was detached on the same service. Through the present dark gloom, Washington discerned a ray of light, and already cherished the hope that much good might result from present evil. "The evacuation of Ticonderoga and Mount Independence," said he in a letter of the 15th of July to General Schuyler, "is an event of chagrin and surprise, not apprehended, nor within the compass of my reasoning. This stroke is severe indeed, and has distressed us much. But, notwithstanding, things at present wear a dark and gloomy aspect. I hope a spirited opposition will check the progress of General Burgoyne's arms, and that the confidence derived from success will hurry him into measures that will, in their consequences, be favorable to us. We should never despair. Our situation has before been unpromising, and has changed for the better, so I trust it will again. If new difficulties arise, we must only put forth new exertions, and proportion our efforts to the exigency of the times." On receiving a letter from General Schuyler of the 17th, stating the divided situation of the British army, he seemed to anticipate the event which afterwards occurred, and to suggest the measure in which originated that torrent of misfortune with which Burgoyne was overwhelmed. "Though our affairs," he said in reply to this information, "have for some days past worn a dark and gloomy aspect, I yet look forward to a fortunate and happy change. I trust General Burgoyne's army will meet, sooner or later, an effectual check, and, as I suggested before, that the success he has met with will precipitate his ruin. From your accounts he appears to be pursuing that line of conduct which, of all others, is most favorable to us. I mean acting in detachment. This conduct will certainly give room for enterprise on our part, and expose his parties to great hazard. Could we be so happy as to cut one of them off, though it should not exceed 400, 500, or 600 men, it would inspirit the people, and do away much of their present anxiety. In such an event they would lose sight of past misfortunes, and, urged at the same time by a regard for their own security, would fly to arms and afford every aid in their power." After allowing a short repose to his army, General Burgoyne proceeded with ardor to the remaining objects of the campaign. The toils and delays which must be encountered in reaching the Hudson were soon perceived. He found it necessary to open Wood Creek and to repair the roads and bridges which Schuyler had broken up. Such was the unavoidable delay of this difficult operation, that the army did not arrive on the Hudson in the neighborhood of Fort Edward till the 14th of July. At this place it was necessary again to halt in order to bring artillery, provisions, bateaux, and other articles from Fort George. Burgoyne approaches Fort Edward, and Schuyler retires to Saratoga, from thence to Stillwater. The time afforded by this delay had been employed by Schuyler to the utmost advantage. Some reinforcements of Continental troops had arrived from Peekskill, and the militia had been assembled, but his strength did not yet afford a reasonable prospect of success in a contest with the enemy opposed to him. On this account, as Burgoyne approached Fort Edward, Schuyler retired over the Hudson to Saratoga, and soon afterwards to Stillwater, not far from the mouth of the Mohawk. At this place General Lincoln, who had been detached to take command of the militia assembling at Manchester, was ordered to rejoin him, and he fortified his camp in the hope of being strong enough to defend it. August 15, at Stillwater, information was obtained that Burgoyne had evacuated Castletown, so that the only communication with Ticonderoga, whence nearly all his supplies were drawn, was through Lake George, and that the garrison of that important place had been reduced to 300 men. In consequence of this intelligence, the orders to General Lincoln were countermanded, and he was directed, with the militia of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and of the Grants, making, as was understood, a total of between 2,000 and 3,000 men, to place himself in the rear of the British army and cut off its communication with the lakes. Here, too, he was informed that Colonel St. Leger, with a large body of Indians, in addition to his regulars, had penetrated from Oswego by the way of the Oneida Lake and Wood Creek to the Mohawk, where he had laid siege to Fort Schuyler and had totally defeated General Herkimer, who had raised the militia of Tryon County in order to relieve the fort. The importance of protecting the inhabitants from the savages and of preventing a junction between St. Leger and Burgoyne, and the consequent loss of the country on the Mohawk, determined Schuyler, weak as he was, to detach Major General Arnold with 3 Continental regiments to raise the siege. The army was so enfeebled by this measure that its removal to a place of greater security became necessary, and it was withdrawn to some islands in the confluence of the Hudson and the Mohawk, where the camp was deemed more defensible. Burgoyne had now marched down the east side of the Hudson, and his advance parties had crossed the river and occupied the ground at Saratoga. St. Leger invests Fort Schuyler. On the 3rd of August, after a message vaunting of his strength and demanding a surrender, which was answered by a declaration that the fort would be defended to the last extremity, St. Leger invested Fort Schuyler. The garrison amounted to 600 men, all Continental troops, who were commanded by Colonel Gansevoort. The besieging army rather exceeded 1,500, of whom from 600 to 900 were Indians. On the approach of the enemy, General Herkimer, who commanded the militia of Tryon County, assembled them in considerable numbers and gave information to the garrison about 11 in the morning of the 6th of his intention to force a passage that day through the besieging army. Gansevoort determined to favor the execution of this design by a vigorous sortie, and upwards of 200 men, to be commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Willett, were drawn out for that purpose. Herkimer, advancing to the relief of the fort, falls into an ambuscade and is defeated with loss. Unfortunately, St. Leger received information the preceding day of Herkimer's approach, and early in the morning placed a strong party, composed of regulars and Indians, in ambuscade on the road along which he was to march. His first notice of it was given by a heavy discharge of small arms, which was followed by a furious attack from the Indians with their tomahawks. He defended himself with resolution, but was defeated with great slaughter. The general and several of the field officers were wounded, and many others, among whom were several persons of distinction, were killed or taken prisoners. The loss was estimated at 400 men. The destruction was prevented from being still more complete by the very timely sortie made by Lieutenant Colonel Willett, which checked the pursuit and recalled those engaged in it to the defense of their own camp. As soon as Gansevoort understood that Herkimer was advancing, the sortie which he had planned was made. Lieutenant Colonel Willett fell on the camp of the besiegers and routed them at the first onset. After driving them, some into the woods and others over the river, he returned to the fort without the loss of a man. Burgoyne had received early intimation of the arrival of St. Leger before Fort Schuyler, and was aware of the advantage to be derived from an immediate and rapid movement down the Hudson. But the obstacles to his progress multiplied daily, and each step produced new embarrassments. Not more than 1/3 of the horses expected from Canada had arrived, and Schuyler had been active in removing the draft cattle of the country. With unremitting exertion, he had been able to transport from Fort George to the Hudson, a distance of 18 miles, only 12 bateaux, and provisions for 4 days in advance. The defectiveness of his means to feed his army until it should reach the abundant country below him presented an impediment to his farther progress not readily to be surmounted. The difficulty of drawing supplies from Fort George would increase every day with the increasing distance, and the communications, already endangered by a considerable body of militia assembling at White Creek, could be secured only by larger detachments from his army than he was in a condition to make. These were strong inducements to attempt some other mode of supply. Colonel Baum was detached to seize the magazines at Bennington. It was well known that large magazines of provisions for the use of the American army were collected at Bennington, which place was generally guarded by militia, whose numbers varied from day to day. The possession of these magazines would enable him to prosecute his ulterior plans without relying for supplies from Lake George, and he determined to seize them. To try the affections of the country, to complete a corps of loyalists, and to mount Rye de Selle's dragoons were subordinate objects of the expedition. Lieutenant Colonel Baum, with 500 Europeans and a body of American loyalists, was detached on this service. To facilitate the enterprise and be ready to take advantage of its success, Burgoyne moved down the east side of the Hudson and threw a bridge of rafts over that river for the passage of his van, which took post at Saratoga. At the same time, Lieutenant Colonel Breckman, with his corps, was advanced to Batten Hill in order, if necessary, to support Colonel Baum. On approaching Bennington, Baum discovered that he should have to encounter a much more considerable force than had been suspected. The New Hampshire militia, commanded by General Stark, had reached that place on their way to camp, and uniting with Colonel Warner, made in the whole about 2,000 men. Perceiving his danger, Baum halted about 4 miles from Bennington and dispatched an express for a reinforcement. In the meantime, he strengthened his position by entrenchments. Lieutenant Colonel Breckman was immediately ordered to his assistance, but such was the state of the roads that, though the distance was only 24 miles and his march was pressed unremittingly from 8 in the morning of the 15th, he did not reach the ground on which Baum had encamped until 4 in the afternoon of the next day. He is attacked in his entrenchments by General Stark and entirely routed. In the meantime, General Stark determined to attack him in his entrenchments. So confident were the provincials belonging to this party of the attachment of the country to the royal cause, that the American troops, while making their dispositions for the attack, were mistaken for armed friends coming to join them. On discovering his error, Baum prepared for the contest and made a gallant defense. His works, however, were carried by storm, and great part of his detachment killed or taken prisoners. A few escaped into the woods and saved themselves by flight. Breckman advances to Baum's aid, is attacked by Colonel Warner, and defeated. Breckman arrived during the pursuit and obtained from the fugitives the first intelligence of the disaster which had befallen them. He immediately attacked the parties of militia who were engaged in the pursuit and gained some advantage over them. Fortunately for the Americans, Colonel Warner came up at this critical juncture with his Continental Regiment and restored and continued the action until the main body of the militia reassembled and came to support him. Breckman, in turn, was compelled to retire, but he maintained the engagement until dark, when, abandoning his artillery and baggage, he saved his party under cover of the night. 1,000 stand of arms and 900 swords were taken in this battle. General Burgoyne represented his loss in men at about 400, but 32 officers and 564 privates, including Canadians and Loyalists, were made prisoners. The number of the dead was not ascertained, because the action with Breckman had been fought in the woods and been continued for several miles. The British general, therefore, must have included in his estimate of loss only his European troops. This important success was soon followed by another of equal influence on the fate of the campaign. Fort Schuyler had been fortified with more skill and was defended with more courage than St-Leger had expected. His artillery made no impression on its walls, and his Indians, who were much better pleased with obtaining plunder and scalps than besieging fortresses, became intractable and manifested great disgust with the service. In this temper they understood that Arnold was advancing with a large body of Continental troops, and soon afterwards were told that Burgoyne and his army had been totally defeated, a report probably founded on the affair at Bennington. Unwilling to share the misfortune of their friends, they manifested a determination not to await the arrival of Arnold. The efforts of St-Leger to detain them being ineffectual, many of them decamped immediately, and the rest threatened to follow. St-Leger abandons the siege of Fort Schuyler and retreats to Ticonderoga. The time for deliberation was past. The camp was broken up, with indications of excessive alarm. The tents were left standing, and the artillery, with great part of the baggage, ammunition, and provisions, fell into the hands of the Americans. The retreating army was pursued by a detachment from the garrison, and it was stated by deserters that the Indians plundered the remaining baggage of the officers and massacred such soldiers as could not keep up with the line of march. St-Leger returned to Montreal, whence he proceeded to Ticonderoga with the intention of joining General Burgoyne by that route. The decisive victory at Bennington and the retreat of St-Leger from Fort Schuyler, however important in themselves, were still more so in their consequences. An army which had spread terror and dismay in every direction, which had previously experienced no reverse of fortune, was considered as already beaten, and the opinion became common that the appearance of the great body of the people in arms would secure the emancipation of their country. It was, too, an advantage of no inconsiderable importance resulting from this change of public opinion, that the disaffected became timid, and the wavering, who, had the torrent of success continued, would have made a merit of contributing their aid to the victor were no longer disposed to put themselves and their fortunes in hazard to support an army whose fate was so uncertain. The barbarities which had been perpetrated by the Indians belonging to the invading armies excited still more resentment than terror. As the prospect of revenge began to open, their effect became the more apparent, and their influence on the royal cause was the more sensibly felt because they had been indiscriminate. The murder of Miss McCrae. The murder of Miss McCrae passed through all the papers of the continent, and the story, being retouched by the hand of more than one master, excited a peculiar degree of sensibility. But there were other causes of still greater influence in producing the events which afterwards took place. The last reinforcements of continental troops arrived in camp about this time, and added both courage and strength to the army. The harvest, which had detained the northern militia upon their farms, was over, and General Schuyler, whose continued and eminent services had not exempted him from the imputation of being a traitor, was succeeded by General Gates, who possessed a large share of the public confidence. General Gates takes command of the Northern Army. When Schuyler was directed by Congress to resume the command of the Northern Department, Gates withdrew himself from it. When the resolution passed recalling the general officers who had served in that department, General Washington was requested to name a successor to Schuyler. On his expressing a wish to decline this nomination and representing the inconvenience of removing all the general officers, Gates was again directed to repair thither and take the command, and their resolution to recall the brigadiers was suspended until the commander-in-chief should be of opinion that it might be carried into effect with safety. Schuyler retained the command until the arrival of Gates, which was on the 19th of August, and continued his exertions to restore the affairs of the department, though he felt acutely the disgrace of being recalled in this critical and interesting state of the campaign. "It is," said he in a letter to the commander-in-chief, "matter of extreme chagrin to me to be deprived of the command at a time when soon, if ever, we shall probably be enabled to face the enemy, when we are on the point of taking ground where they must attack to a disadvantage should our force be inadequate to facing them in the field, when an opportunity will in all probability occur in which I might evince that I am not what Congress have too plainly insinuated by taking the command from me." If error be attributable to the evacuation of Ticonderoga, no portion of it was committed by Schuyler. His removal from the command was probably severe and unjust as respected himself, but perhaps wise as respected America. The frontier towards the lakes was to be defended by the troops of New England, and however unfounded their prejudices against him might be, it was prudent to consult them. Notwithstanding the difficulties which multiplied around him, Burgoyne remained steady to his purpose. The disasters at Bennington and on the Mohawk produced no disposition to abandon the enterprise and save his army. September 14, Burgoyne encamps on the heights of Saratoga. It had now become necessary to recur to the slow and toilsome mode of obtaining supplies from Fort George. Having with persevering labor collected provision for 30 days in advance, he crossed the Hudson on the 13th and 14th of September and encamped on the heights and plains of Saratoga with a determination to decide the fate of the expedition in a general engagement. General Gates, having been joined by all the continental troops destined for the Northern Department and reinforced by large bodies of militia, had moved from his camp in the islands and advanced to the neighborhood of Stillwater. He attacks Gates at Stillwater, September 19. The bridges between the two armies having been broken down, the roads being excessively bad, and the country covered with wood, the progress of the British army down the river was slow. On the night of the 17th, Burgoyne encamped within 4 miles of the American army, and the next day was employed in repairing the bridges between the two camps. In the morning of the 19th, he advanced in full force towards the American left. Morgan was immediately detached with his corps to observe the enemy and to harass his front and flanks. He fell in with a picket in front of the right wing, which he attacked with vivacity and drove in upon the main body. Pursuing with too much ardor, he was met in considerable force, and after a severe encounter was compelled in turn to retire in some disorder. 2 regiments being advanced to his assistance, his corps was rallied, and the action became more general. The Americans were formed in a wood with an open field in front, and invariably repulsed the British corps which attacked them, but when they pursued those corps to the main body, they were in turn driven back to their first ground. Reinforcements were continually brought up, and about 4 in the afternoon upwards of 3,000 American troops were closely engaged with the whole right wing of the British army, commanded by General Burgoyne in person. The conflict was extremely severe and only terminated with the day. At dark the Americans retired to their camp, and the British, who had found great difficulty in maintaining their ground, lay all night on their arms near the field of battle. In this action the killed and wounded on the part of the Americans were between 300 and 400. Among the former were Colonels Coburn and Adams and several other valuable officers. The British loss has been estimated at rather more than 500 men. Each army claimed the victory, and each believed itself to have beaten near the whole of the hostile army with only a part of its own force. The advantage, however, taking all circumstances into consideration, was decidedly with the Americans. In a conflict which nearly consumed the day, they found themselves at least equal to their antagonists. In every quarter they had acted on the offensive, and after an encounter for several hours had not lost an inch of ground. They had not been driven from the field, but had retired from it at the close of day to the camp from which they had marched to battle. Their object, which was to check the advancing enemy, had been obtained, while that of the British general had failed. In the actual state of things, to fight without being beaten was on their part victory, while on the part of the British to fight without a decisive victory was defeat. The Indians, who found themselves beaten in the woods by Morgan and restrained from scalping and plundering the unarmed by Burgoyne, who saw before them the prospect of hard fighting without profit, grew tired of the service and deserted in great numbers. The Canadians and provincials were not much more faithful, and Burgoyne soon perceived that his hopes must rest almost entirely on his European troops. With reason, therefore, this action was celebrated throughout the United States as a victory, and considered as the precursor of the total ruin of the invading army. The utmost exultation was displayed, and the militia were stimulated to fly to arms and complete the work so happily begun. General Lincoln, in conformity with directions which have been stated, had assembled a considerable body of New England militia in the rear of Burgoyne, from which he drew three parties of about 500 men each. One of these was detached under the command of Colonel Brown to the north end of Lake George, principally to relieve a number of prisoners who were confined there, but with orders to push his success should he be fortunate as far as prudence would admit. Colonel Johnson, at the head of another party, marched towards Mount Independence, and Colonel Woodbury, with a third, was detached to Steensboro to cover the retreat of both the others. With the residue, Lincoln proceeded to the camp of Gates. Colonel Brown, after marching all night, arrived at the break of day on the north end of the lake, where he found a small post which he carried without opposition. The surprise was complete, and he took possession of Mount Defiance, Mount Hope, the landing place, and about 200 bateaux. With the loss of only 3 killed and 5 wounded, he liberated 100 American prisoners and captured 293 of the enemy. This success was joyfully proclaimed through the northern states. It was believed confidently that Ticonderoga and Mount Independence were recovered, and the militia were exhorted, by joining their brethren in the army, to ensure that event if it had not already happened. The attempt on those places, however, failed. The garrison repulsed the assailants, who after a few days abandoned the siege. On their return through Lake George in the vessels they had captured, the militia made an attack on Diamond Island, the depot of all the stores collected at the north end of the lake. Being again repulsed, they destroyed the vessels they had taken and returned to their former station. September 21, the day after the Battle of Stillwater, General Burgoyne took a position almost within cannon shot of the American camp, fortified his right, and extended his left to the river. Directly after taking this ground, he received a letter from Sir Henry Clinton, informing him that he should attack Fort Montgomery about the 20th of September. The messenger returned with information that Burgoyne was in extreme difficulty and would endeavor to wait for aid until the 12th of October. Both armies retained their position until the 7th of October, Burgoyne in the hope of being relieved by Sir Henry Clinton, and Gates in the confidence of growing stronger every day. October 7. Having received no farther intelligence from Sir Henry, and being reduced to the necessity of diminishing the ration issued to his soldiers, the British general determined to make one more trial of strength with his adversary. In execution of this determination, he drew out on his right 1,500 choice troops, whom he commanded in person, assisted by General Phillips, Riedesel, and Fraser. The right wing was formed within 3/4 of a mile of the left of the American camp, and a corps of Rangers, Indians, and Provincials was pushed on through secret paths to show themselves in its rear and excite alarm in that quarter. These movements were perceived by General Gates, who determined to attack their left, and at the same time to fall on their right flank. Poor's brigade and some regimentals from New Hampshire were ordered to meet them in front, while Morgan with his rifle corps made a circuit unperceived and seized a very advantageous height covered with wood on their right. As soon as it was supposed that Morgan had gained the ground he intended to occupy, the attack was made in front and on the left in great force. At this critical moment Morgan poured in a deadly and incessant fire on the front and right flank. While the British right wing was thus closely pressed in front and on its flank, A distinct division of the American troops was ordered to intercept its retreat to camp and to separate it from the residue of the army. Burgoyne perceived the danger of his situation and ordered the light infantry under General Fraser with part of the 24th Regiment to form a second line in order to cover the light infantry of the right and secure a retreat. While this movement was in progress, the left of the British right was forced from its ground, and the light infantry was ordered to its aid. In the attempt to execute this order, they were attacked by the Rifle Corps with great effect, and Fraser was mortally wounded. Overpowered by numbers and pressed on all sides by a superior weight of fire, Burgoyne, with great difficulty and with the loss of his field pieces and great part of his artillery corps, regained his camp. The Americans followed close in his rear and assaulted his works throughout their whole extent. Towards the close of the day, the entrenchments were forced on their right, and General Arnold, with a few men, actually entered their works, but his horse being killed under him and himself wounded, the troops were forced out of them, and it being nearly dark, they desisted from the assault. The left of Arnold's division was still more successful. Jackson's regiment of Massachusetts, then led by Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, turned the right of the encampment and stormed the works occupied by the German reserve. Lieutenant Colonel Breckman, who commanded in them, was killed, and the works were carried. The orders given by Burgoyne to recover them were not executed, and Brooks maintained the ground he had gained. Darkness put an end to the action, and the Americans lay all night with their arms in their hands, about half a mile from the British lines, ready to renew the assault with the return of day. The advantage they had gained was decisive. They had taken several pieces of artillery, killed a great number of men, made upwards of 200 prisoners, among whom were several officers of distinction, and had penetrated the lines in a part which exposed the whole to considerable danger. Unwilling to risk the events of the next day on the same ground, Burgoyne changed his position in the course of the night and drew his whole army into a strong camp on the river heights, extending his right up the river. This movement extricated him from the danger of being attacked the ensuing morning by an enemy already in possession of part of his works. October 8, General Gates perceived the strength of this position and was not disposed to hazard an assault. Aware of the critical situation of his adversary, he detached a party higher up the Hudson for the purpose of intercepting the British army on its retreat, while strong corps were posted on the other side of the river to guard its passage. Retreats to Saratoga. This movement compelled Burgoyne again to change his position and to retire to Saratoga. About 9 at night, the retreat was commenced and was effected with the loss of his hospital, containing about 300 sick, and of several bateaux laden with provision and baggage. On reaching the ground to be occupied, he found a strong corps already entrenched on the opposite side of the river, prepared to dispute its passage. October 10, from Saratoga, Burgoyne detached a company of artificers under a strong escort to repair the roads and bridges towards Fort Edward. Scarcely had this detachment moved when the Americans appeared in force on the heights south of Saratoga Creek and made dispositions which excited the apprehension of a design to cross it and attack his camp. The Europeans escorting the artificers were recalled, and a provincial corps employed in the same service, being attacked by a small party, ran away and left the workmen to shift for themselves. No hope of repairing the roads remaining, it became impossible to move the baggage and artillery. The British army was now almost completely environed by a superior force. No means remained of extricating itself from difficulties and dangers which were continually increasing, but fording a river on the opposite bank of which a formidable body of troops was already posted, and then escaping to Fort George through roads impassable by artillery or wagons, while its rear was closely pressed by a victorious enemy. A council of general officers called to deliberate on their situation took the bold resolution to abandon everything but their arms and such provisions as the soldiers could carry, and by a forced march in the night up the river to extricate themselves from the American army, and crossing at Fort Edward or at a ford above it to press on to Fort George. Gates had foreseen this movement and had prepared for it. In addition to placing strong guards at the fords of the Hudson, he had formed an entrenched camp on the high grounds between Fort Edward and Fort George. The scouts sent to examine the route returned with this information, and the plan was abandoned as impracticable. Nothing could be more hopeless than the condition of the British army, or more desperate than that of their general, as described by himself in his letter to Lord George German, Secretary of State for American Affairs. He says, "A series of hard toil, incessant effort, stubborn action, until disabled in the collateral branches of the army by the total defection of the Indians, the desertion or timidity of the Canadians and provincials, some individuals excepted, disappointed in the last hope of any cooperation from other armies, the regular troops reduced by losses from the best parts to 3,500 fighting men, not 2,000 of which were British, only 3 days' provisions upon short allowance and store, invested by an army of 16,000 men, and no appearance of retreat remaining. I called into council all the generals, field officers, and captains commanding corps, and by their unanimous concurrence and advice, I was induced to open a treaty with Major General Gates. A treaty was opened with a general proposition stating the willingness of the British general to spare the further effusion of blood, provided a negotiation could be effected on honorable terms. Surrender of the army under Burgoyne, October 17. This proposition was answered by a demand that the whole army should ground their arms in their encampment and surrender themselves prisoners of war. This demand was instantly rejected with a declaration that if General Gates designed to insist on it, the negotiation must immediately break off and hostilities recommence. On receiving this decided answer, Gates receded from the rigorous terms at first proposed, and a convention was signed in which it was agreed that the British army, after marching out of their encampment with all the honors of war, should lay down their arms and not serve against the United States till exchanged. They were not to be detained in captivity, but to be permitted to embark for England. The situation of the armies considered, these terms were highly honorable to the British general and favorable to his nation. They were probably more advantageous than would have been granted by General Gates had he entertained no apprehension from Sir Henry Clinton, who was at length making the promised diversion on the North River, up which he had penetrated as far as Esopus. The drafts made from Peekskill for both armies had left that post in a situation to require the aid of militia for its security. The requisitions of General Putnam were complied with, but the attack upon them being delayed, the militia, who were anxious to cede their farms, became impatient, many deserted, and General Putnam was induced to discharge the residue. Governor Clinton immediately ordered out half the militia of New York, with assurances that they should be relieved in 1 month by the other half. This order was executed so slowly that the forts were carried before the militia were in the field. Great pains have been taken and much labor employed to render this position, which is naturally strong, still more secure. The principal defenses were Forts Montgomery and Clinton. They had been constructed on the western bank of the Hudson, on very high ground, extremely difficult of access, and were separated from each other by a small creek which runs from the mountains into the river. These forts were too much elevated to be battered from the water, and the hills on which they stood were too steep to be ascended by troops landing at the foot of them. The mountains, which commence 5 or 6 miles below them, are so high and rugged, the defiles through which the roads leading to them pass so narrow, and so commanded by the heights on both sides, that the approaches to them are extremely difficult and dangerous. To prevent ships from passing the forts, chevaux de frise have been sunk into the river, and a boom extended from bank to bank, which was covered with immense chains stretched at some distance in its front. These works were defended by the guns of the forts and by a frigate and galleys stationed above them, capable of opposing with an equal fire in front any force which might attack them by water from below. Fort Independence is 4 or 5 miles below Forts Montgomery and Clinton, and on the opposite side of the river, on a high point of land, and Fort Constitution is rather more than 6 miles above them, on an island near the eastern shore. Peekskill, the general headquarters of the officer commanding at the station, is just below Fort Independence and on the same side of the river. The garrisons have been reduced to about 600 men, and the whole force under General Putnam did not much exceed 2,000. Yet this force, though far inferior to that which General Washington had ordered to be retained at the station, was, if properly applied, more than competent to the defense of the forts against any numbers which could be spared from New York. To ensure success to the enterprise, it was necessary to draw the attention of Putnam from the real object, and to storm the works before the garrisons could be aided by his army. This Sir Henry Clinton accomplished. October 6, between 3,000 and 4,000 men embarked at New York, and landed on the 5th of October at Verplank's Point, on the east side of the Hudson, a short distance below Peekskill, upon which General Putnam retired to the heights in his rear. On the evening of the same day, a part of these troops re-embarked, and the fleet moved up the river to Peekskill Neck in order to mask King's Ferry, which was below them. The next morning, at break of day, the troops destined for the enterprise landed on the west side of Stony Point, and commenced their march through the mountains into the rear of Forts Clinton and Montgomery. This disembarkation was observed, but the morning was so foggy that the numbers could not be distinguished, and a large fire, which was afterwards perceived at the landing place, suggested the idea that the sole object of the party on the shore was the burning of some storehouses. In the meantime, the maneuvers of the vessels and the appearance of a small detachment left at Verplank's Point persuaded General Putnam that the meditated attack was on Fort Independence. Forts Montgomery and Clinton taken by the British. His whole attention was directed to this object, and the real designs of the enemy were not suspected until a heavy firing from the other side of the river announced the assault on Forts Clinton and Montgomery. 500 men were instantly detached to reinforce the garrisons of those places, but before this detachment could cross the river, the forts were in possession of the British. Having left a battalion at the pass of Thunder Hill to keep up a communication, Sir Henry Clinton had formed his army into 2 divisions, one of which, consisting of 900 men, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Campbell, made a circuit by the Forest of Dean in order to fall on the back of Fort Montgomery, while the other, consisting of 1,200 men, commanded by General Vaughan and accompanied by Sir Henry Clinton in person, advanced slowly against Fort Clinton. Both posts were assaulted about 5 in the afternoon. The works were defended with resolution and were maintained until dark, when the lines being too extensive to be completely manned, the assailants entered them in different places. The defense being no longer possible, some of the garrison were made prisoners, while their better knowledge of the country enabled others to escape. Governor Clinton passed the river in a boat, and General James Clinton, though wounded in the thigh by a bayonet, also made his escape. Lieutenant Colonels Livingston and Brune and Majors Hamilton and Logan were among the prisoners. The loss sustained by the garrisons was about 250 men. That of the assailants was stated by Sir H. Clinton at less than 200. Among the killed were Lieutenant Colonel Campbell and 2 other field officers. Peekskill, together with Forts Independence and Constitution, evacuated by the Americans. As the boom and chains drawn across the river could no longer be defended, the Continental frigates and galleys lying above them were burnt to prevent their falling into the hands of the enemy. Fort Independence and Fort Constitution were evacuated the next day, and Putnam retreated to Fishkill. General Vaughan, after burning Continental Village, where stores to a considerable amount had been deposited, proceeded at the head of a strong detachment up the river to Esopus, which he also destroyed. October 8, General Putnam, whose army had been augmented by reinforcements of militia to 6,000 men, detached General Parsons with 2,000 to repossess himself of Peekskill and of the passes in the highlands, while with the residue he watched the progress of the enemy up the river. The want of heavy artillery prevented his annoying their ships in the Hudson. On the capitulation of Burgoyne, near 5,000 men had been detached by Gates to his aid. Before their arrival, General Vaughan had returned to New York, whence a reinforcement to General Howe was then about to sail. Great as was the injury sustained by the United States from this enterprise, Great Britain derived from it no solid advantage. It was undertaken at too late a period to save Burgoyne, and though the passes in the highlands were acquired, they could not be retained. The British had reduced to ashes every village and almost every house within their power, but this wanton and useless destruction served to irritate without tending to subdue. A keenness was given to the resentment of the injured, which outlasted the contest between the two nations. The army which surrendered at Saratoga exceeded 5,000 men. On marching from Ticonderoga, it was estimated at 9,000. In addition to this great military force, the British lost and the Americans acquired a fine train of artillery, 7,000 stand of excellent arms, clothing for 7,000 recruits, with tents and other military stores to a considerable amount. The thanks of Congress were voted to General Gates and his army, and a medal of gold in commemoration of this great event was ordered to be struck and presented to him by the President in the name of the United States. Colonel Wilkinson, his adjutant general, whom he strongly recommended, was appointed brigadier general by brevet. The Saratoga Battle Monument, Schuylerville, New York. Nothing bespeaks more strongly the consummate tragedy of Benedict Arnold's career than the battle monument which rises on the banks of the Hudson to commemorate the victory of Saratoga. In the square shaft are 4 high Gothic arches, and in these are placed heroic statues of the generals who won the victory. Horatio Gates, unworthy though he was, stands there in bronze. The gallant Schuyler, the intrepid Morgan, honor the other two, but where is he whose valor turned back the advancing Saint-Leger, whose prompt decision saved the Continental position at Bemis Heights, whose military genius truly gained the day? A vacant niche, empty as England's rewards, void as his own life, speaks more eloquently than words, more strongly than condemnation, more pitifully than tears, of a mighty career blighted by treason and hurled into the bottomless pit of despair. This is America's way of honoring Arno in his dishonor. From the real America in romance, in the opinion that the British would not immediately abandon the passes in the highlands, Congress ordered Putnam to join General Washington with a reinforcement not exceeding 2,500 men, and directed Gates to take command of the army on the Hudson, with unlimited powers to call for aids of militia from the New England states, as well as from New York and New Jersey. A proposition to authorize the commander-in-chief, after consulting with General Gates and Governor Clinton, to increase the detachment designed to strengthen his army, if he should then be of opinion that it might be done without endangering the objects to be accomplished by Gates, was seriously opposed. An attempt was made to amend this proposition so as to make the increase of the reinforcement to depend on the assent of Gates and Clinton, but this amendment was lost by a considerable majority, and the original resolution was carried. These proceedings were attended with no other consequences than to excite some degree of attention to the state of parties. Ticonderoga and Mount Independence evacuated by the enemy. Soon after the capitulation of Burgoyne, Ticonderoga and Mount Independence were evacuated, and the garrison retired to Ile aux Noix and St. John's. The effect produced by this event on the British cabinet and nation was great and immediate. It seemed to remove the delusive hopes of conquest with which they had been flattered, and suddenly to display the mass of resistance which must yet be encountered. Previous to the reception of this disastrous intelligence, the employment of savages in the war had been the subject of severe animadversion. Parliament was assembled on the 20th of November, and as usual addresses were proposed in answer to the speech from the throne, entirely approving the conduct of the administration. In the House of Lords, the Earl of Chatham moved to amend the address by introducing a clause recommending to His Majesty an immediate cessation of hostilities and the commencement of a treaty of conciliation to restore peace and liberty to America, strength and happiness to England, security and permanent prosperity to both countries. In the course of the very animated observations made by this extraordinary man in support of his motion, he said, "But, my lords, who is the man that, in addition to the disgraces and mischiefs of war, has dared to authorize and associate to our arms the tomahawk and scalping knife of the savage, to call into civilized alliance the wild and inhuman inhabitant of the woods, to delegate to the merciless Indian the defense of disputed rights, and to wage the horrors of his barbarous war against our brethren? My lords, these enormities cry aloud for redress and punishment. Unless thoroughly done away, they will be a stain on the national character. It is not the least of our national misfortunes that the strength and character of our army are thus impaired. Familiarized to the horrid scenes of savage cruelty, it can no longer boast of the noble and generous principles which dignify a soldier, no longer sympathize with the dignity of the royal banner, nor feel the pride, pomp, and circumstance of glorious war that makes ambition virtue. What makes ambition virtue? The sense of honor. But is this sense of honor consistent with the spirit of plunder or the practice of murder? Can it flow from mercenary motives, or can it prompt to cruel deeds? The conduct of administration, however, received the full approbation of large majorities, but the triumph these victories in Parliament afforded them was of short duration. The disastrous issue of an expedition from which the most sanguine expectations had been formed was soon known, and the mortification it produced was extreme. A reluctant confession of the calamity was made by the minister, and a desire to restore peace on any terms consistent with the integrity of the empire found its way into the cabinet. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11, Part 1 of the Life of Washington, Volume 2, by John Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, Defects in the Commissary Department, Distress of the Army at Valley Forge, the Army subsisted by impressments, combination in Congress against General Washington, correspondence between him and General Gates, distress of the army for clothes, Washington's exertions to augment the army, Congress sends a committee to camp, attempt to surprise Captain Lee, Congress determines on a second expedition to Canada, abandons it, General Conway resigns, the Baron Steuben appointed Inspector General, Congress forbids the embarkation of Burgoyne's army, plan of reconciliation agreed to in Parliament, communicated to Congress and rejected, information of treaties between France and the United States, Great Britain declares war against France, the treaties with France ratified by Congress, complaints of the treatment of prisoners, a partial exchange agreed to. 1777, the army under the immediate command of General Washington was engaged through the winter in endeavoring to stop the intercourse between Philadelphia and the country. To effect this object, General Smallwood was detached with one division to Wilmington. Colonel Morgan was placed on the lines on the west side of the Schuylkill, and General Armstrong with the Pennsylvania militia was stationed near the old camp at White Marsh. Major Jameson, with 2 troops of cavalry and McLean's infantry, was directed to guard the east, and Captain Lee with his troop the west side of that river. General Count Pulaski, a Polish nobleman who commanded the horse, led the residue of the cavalry to Trenton, where he trained them for the ensuing campaign. December 22. One of the first operations meditated by General Washington after crossing the Schuylkill was the destruction of a large quantity of hay, which remained in the islands above the mouth of Darby Creek, within the power of the British. Early in the morning after his orders for this purpose had been given, Sir William Howe marched out in full force and encamped between Darby and the middle party. so as completely to cover the islands, while a foraging party removed the hay. Washington, with the intention of disturbing this operation, gave orders for putting his army in motion, when the alarming fact was disclosed that the commissary's stores were exhausted and that the last ration had been delivered and consumed. Accustomed as were the Continental troops to privations of every sort, it would have been hazarding too much to move them, under these circumstances, against a powerful enemy. In a desert or a garrison where food is unattainable, courage, patriotism, and habits of discipline enable the soldier to conquer wants which in ordinary situations would be deemed invincible. But to perish in a country abounding with provisions requires something more than fortitude, nor can soldiers readily submit, while in such a country, to the deprivation of food. It is not, therefore, surprising that, among a few of the troops, some indications of a mutiny appeared. It is much more astonishing that the great body of the army bore a circumstance so irritating, and to them so unaccountable, without a murmur. On receiving intelligence of the fact, General Washington ordered the country to be scoured and provisions for supplying the pressing wants of the moment to be seized wherever found. In the meantime, light parties were detached to harass the enemy about Derby, where Sir William Howe, with his accustomed circumspection, kept his army so compact and his soldiers so within the lines that an opportunity to annoy him was seldom afforded even to the vigilance of Morgan and Lee. After completing his voyage, he returned with inconsiderable loss to Philadelphia. That the American army, while the value still retained by paper bills placed ample funds in the hands of government, should be destitute of food in the midst of a state so abounding with provisions as Pennsylvania, is one of those extraordinary facts which cannot fail to excite attention. Defects in the commissary department. Early in the war, the office of commissary general had been conferred on Colonel Trumbull of Connecticut, a gentleman fitted by his talents, activity, and zeal for that important station. Yet from the difficulty of arranging so complicated a department in its commencement, without the advantages of experience, complaints were repeatedly made of the insufficiency of supplies. The subject was taken up by Congress, but the remedy administered, as well from the time of its application as from the ingredients of which it was composed, served only to increase the disease. The system was not completed until near midsummer, and then its arrangements were such that Colonel Trumbull refused to accept the office assigned to him, and new men were to be called into service at a time when the strongest necessity required the exertions of those who understood the plan of supplies for the campaign in all its modifications. In addition to the commissary of purchases and a commissary general of issues, each to be appointed by Congress, the new plan contemplated 4 deputies in each department, also to be appointed by that body, who were not accountable to nor removable by the head of the department, but might be suspended and accused before Congress, who should examine the charge and either remove the accused from his office or reinstate him in it. Distress of the American army at Valley Forge for provisions. This imperium in imperio, erected in direct opposition to the opinion of the commander-in-chief, drove Colonel Trumbull from the army. Congress, however, persisted in the system, and the effects of deranging so important a department as that which feeds the troops in the midst of a campaign were not long in unfolding themselves. In every military division of the continent, loud complaints were made of the deficiency of supplies. The success of Gates appears to have been more endangered by this cause than by the movement of Sir Henry Clinton up the Hudson. The army of General Washington was often greatly embarrassed, and his movements not unfrequently suspended by the want of provisions. The present total failure of all supply was preceded for a few days by the issuing of meat unfit to be eaten. Representations on this subject were made to the commander-in-chief, who on the morning that Sir William Howe moved out to Derby, and before intelligence of that movement had been received, communicated them to Congress. The army subsisted in a great measure by impressments. That body had authorized the commander-in-chief to seize provisions for the use of his army within 70 miles of headquarters, and either to pay for them in money or in certificates, for the redemption of which the faith of the United States was pledged. The odium of this measure was increased by the failure of the government to provide funds to take up these certificates when presented. At the same time, the provisions carried into Philadelphia were paid for in specie at a good price. The inhabitants of that part of Pennsylvania were not zealous in support of the war, and the difference between prompt payment in gold or silver and a certificate, the value of which was often diminished by depreciation before its payment, was too great not to influence their wishes and their conduct. Such was the dexterity they employed, that, notwithstanding the rigor of the laws and the vigilance of the troops stationed on the lines, they often succeeded in concealing their provisions from those who were authorized to impress for the army, and in conveying them privately into Philadelphia. December 10, General Washington exercised the powers confided in him with caution, but he did exercise them, and by doing so acquired considerable supplies. Congress appeared as much dissatisfied with the lenity of the commander-in-chief as the people were with his rigor, in consequence of which the subject was taken into consideration, his forbearance disapproved, and instructions given for the rigorous exertions in future of the powers with which he was invested. In reply to the letter communicating these resolves, the general stated the conduct he had observed, insisted that provisions had been taken very extensively, and repeated his opinion that such measures would be much more readily submitted to if executed by the civil authority. In obedience, however, to the will of Congress, he issued a proclamation requiring the farmers within 70 miles of headquarters to thrash out one half of their grain by the 1st of February and the residue by the 1st of March, under the penalty of having the whole seized as straw. The success of this experiment did not correspond with the wishes of Congress. It was attended with the pernicious consequences which had been foreseen by the general, to avoid which he had considered this system as a dernier ressort, of which he was to avail himself only in extreme cases. In answer to a letter on this subject from the Board of War, he said, "I shall use every exertion that may be expedient and practicable for subsisting the army and keeping it together, but I must observe that this never can be done by coercive means. Supplies of provisions and clothing must be had in another way, or it cannot exist." The small seizures that were made of the former some time ago, in consequence of the most pressing and urgent necessity, when the alternative was to do that or dissolve, excited the greatest alarm and uneasiness imaginable, even among some of our best and warmest friends. Such procedures may relieve for an instant, but eventually will prove of the most pernicious consequence. Besides spreading disaffection and jealousy among the people, they never fail, even in the most veteran armies, to raise in the soldiery a disposition to licentiousness, plunder, and robbery, which it has ever been found exceeding difficult to suppress, and which has not only proved ruinous to the inhabitants, but in many instances to the armies themselves. In a subsequent letter to Congress he added, "I regret the occasion which compelled us to the measure the other day, and shall consider it as among the greatest of our misfortunes to be under the necessity of practicing it again. I am now obliged to keep several parties from the army thrashing grain, that our supplies may not fail, but this will not do." Combination formed in Congress against General Washington, General Gates supposed to be concerned in it. About this time a strong combination was forming against the commander-in-chief, into which several members of Congress and a very few officers of the army are believed to have entered. The splendor with which the capture of a British army had surrounded the military reputation of General Gates acquired some advocates for the opinion that the arms of America would be more fortunate should that gentleman be elevated to the supreme command. He could not be supposed hostile himself to the prevalence of this opinion, and some parts of his conduct would seem to warrant a belief that, if it did not originate with him, he was not among the last to adopt it. After the victory of the 7th of October had opened to him the prospect of subduing the arms of Burgoyne, he not only omitted to communicate his success to General Washington, correspondence on the subject between the two generals, but carried on a correspondence with General Conway, in which that officer expressed great contempt for the commander-in-chief. When the purport of this correspondence was disclosed to General Washington, Gates demanded the name of the informer in a letter far from being conciliatory in its terms, which was accompanied with the very extraordinary circumstance of being passed through Congress. The State of Pennsylvania, too, chagrined at the loss of its capital and forgetful of its own backwardness in strengthening the army, which had twice fought superior numbers in its defense, furnished many discontented individuals. They imputed it to General Washington as a fault that with forces inferior to his enemy in numbers and in every equipment, he had not effected the same result which had been produced in the North by a continental army in itself much stronger than its adversary, and so reinforced by militia as to treble his numbers. On the report that General Washington was moving into winter quarters, the legislature of that State addressed a remonstrance to Congress on the subject, manifesting in very intelligible terms their dissatisfaction with the commander-in-chief. About the same time a new Board of War was created, of which General Gates was appointed the president, and General Mifflin, who was supposed to be of the party unfriendly to Washington, was one of its members. General Conway, who was probably the only brigadier in the army that had joined this faction, was appointed inspector general and was promoted above senior brigadiers to the rank of major general. These were evidences that if the hold which the commander-in-chief had taken of the affections and confidence of the army and of the nation could be loosened, the party in Congress, disposed to change their general, was far from being contemptible in point of numbers. But to loosen this hold was impossible. The indignation with which the idea of such a change was received even by the victorious troops who had conquered under Gates forms the most conclusive proof of its strength. Even the Northern army clung to Washington as the savior of his country. These machinations to diminish the well-earned reputation of the commander-in-chief could not escape his notice. They made, however, no undue impression on his steady mind, nor did they change one of his measures. His sensibilities seemed to have been those of patriotism, of apprehension for his country, rather than of wounded pride. His desire to remain at the head of the army seemed to flow from the conviction that his retaining that station would be useful to his country, rather than from the gratification his high rank might furnish to ambition. When he unbosomed himself to his private friends, the feelings and sentiments he expressed were worthy of Washington. To Mr. Laurens, the President of Congress, and his private friend, who in an unofficial letter had communicated an anonymous accusation made to him as President, containing heavy charges against the Commander-in-Chief, he said, "I cannot sufficiently express the obligation I feel towards you for your friendship and politeness upon an occasion in which I am deeply interested. I was not unapprised that a malignant faction had been for some time forming to my prejudice, which, conscious as I am of having ever done all in my power to answer the important purposes of the trust reposed in me, could not but give me some pain on a personal account. But my chief concern arises from an apprehension of the dangerous consequences which intestine dissensions may produce to the common cause. As I have no other view than to promote the public good, and am unambitious of honors not founded in the approbation of my country, I would not desire in the least degree to suppress a free spirit of inquiry into any part of my conduct that even faction itself may deem reprehensible. The anonymous paper handed you exhibits many serious charges, and it is my wish that it may be submitted to Congress. This I am the more inclined to, as the suppression or concealment may possibly involve you in embarrassment hereafter, since it is uncertain how many or who may be privy to the contents. My enemies take an ungenerous advantage of me. They know the delicacy of my situation, and that motives of policy deprive me of the defense I might otherwise make against their insidious attacks. They know I cannot combat their insinuations, however injurious, without disclosing secrets it is of the utmost moment to conceal. But why should I expect to be free from censure, the unfailing lot of an elevated station? Merit and talents, which I cannot pretend to rival, have ever been subject to it. My heart tells me it has been my unremitted aim to do the best which circumstances would permit, yet I may have been very often mistaken in my judgment of the means, and may in many instances deserve the imputation of error. Fortunately for America, these combinations only excited resentment against those who were believed to be engaged in them. December, soon after being informed of the unfavorable disposition of some members of Congress towards him, and receiving the memorial of the legislature of Pennsylvania against his going into winter quarters, the general also discovered the failure already mentioned in the commissary department. On this occasion he addressed Congress in terms of energy and plainness which he had used on no former occasion. December 23, in his letter to that body, he said, "Full as I was in my representation of the matters in the commissary's department yesterday, fresh and more powerful reasons oblige me to add that I am now convinced beyond a doubt that unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place in that line, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these three things: to starve, dissolve, or disperse, in order to obtain subsistence. Rest assured, sir, that this is not an exaggerated picture, and that I have abundant reason to suppose what I say." Saturday afternoon, receiving information that the enemy in force had left the city and were advancing towards Derby with apparent design to forage and draw subsistence from that part of the country, I ordered the troops to be in readiness, that I might give every opposition in my power, when to my great mortification I was not only informed but convinced that the men were unable to stir on account of a want of provisions, and that a dangerous mutiny, begun the night before, and which with difficulty was suppressed by the spirited exertions of some officers, was still much to be apprehended from the want of this article. This brought forth the only commissary in the purchasing line in this camp, and with him this melancholy and alarming truth, that he had not a single hoof of any kind to slaughter, and not more than 25 barrels of flour. From hence form an opinion of our situation, when I add that he could not tell when to expect any. Distress of the American army for clothes. All I could do under these circumstances was to send out a few light parties to watch and harass the enemy, whilst other parties were instantly detached different ways to collect, if possible, as much provision as would satisfy the present pressing wants of the soldiers. But will this answer? No, sir. 3 or 4 days of bad weather would prove our destruction. What then is to become of the army this winter? And if we are now as often without provisions as with them, what is to become of us in the spring, when our force will be collected, with the aid perhaps of militia, to take advantage of an early campaign before the enemy can be reinforced? These are considerations of great magnitude, meriting the closest attention, and will, when my own reputation is so intimately connected with and to be affected by the event, justify my saying that the present commissaries are by no means equal to the execution of the office, or that the disaffection of the people surpasses all belief. The misfortune, however, does, in my opinion, proceed from both causes, and though I have been tender heretofore of giving any opinion, or of lodging complaints, as the change in that department took place contrary to my judgment, and the consequences thereof were predicted, yet finding that the inactivity of the army, whether for want of provisions, clothes, or other essentials, is charged to my account, not only by the common vulgar, but by those in power, it is time to speak plain in exculpation of myself. With truth, then, I can declare that no man, in my opinion, ever had his measures more impeded than I have by every department of the army. Since the month of July we have had no assistance from the quartermaster general, and to want of assistance from this department the commissary general charges great part of his deficiency. To this I am to add that, notwithstanding it is a standing order, often repeated, that the troops shall always have 2 days' provisions by them, that they may be ready at any sudden call, yet scarcely any opportunity is ever offered of taking advantage of the enemy that has not been either totally obstructed or greatly impeded on this account. And this, the great and crying evil, is not all. Soap, vinegar, and other articles allowed by Congress we see none of, nor have we seen them, I believe, since the battle of Brandywine. The first, indeed, we have little occasion for, few men having more than one shirt, many only the moiety of one, and some none at all, in addition to which, as a proof of the little benefit from a clothier general, and at the same time as a farther proof of the inability of an army under the circumstances of this to perform the common duties of soldiers, we have by a field return this day made, besides a number of men confined to hospitals for want of shoes, and others in farmers' houses on the same account, no less than 2,898 men now in camp unfit for duty, because they are barefoot and otherwise naked. By the same return it appears that our whole strength in continental troops, including the eastern brigades which have joined us since the surrender of General Burgoyne, exclusive of the Maryland troops sent to Wilmington, amounts to no more than 8,200 in camp, fit for duty, notwithstanding which, and that since the 4th instant, our number fit for duty, from the hardships and exposures they have undergone, particularly from the want of blankets, have decreased near 2,000 men. We find, gentlemen, without knowing whether the army was really going into winter quarters or not, for I am sure no resolution of mine would warrant the remonstrance, reprobating the measure as much as if they thought the soldiers were made of stocks or stones, and equally insensible of frost and snow, and moreover as if they conceived it easily practicable for an inferior army, under the disadvantages I have described ours to be, which are by no means exaggerated, to confine a superior one, in all respects well appointed and provided for a winter's campaign within the city of Philadelphia, and to cover from depredation and waste the states of Pennsylvania, Jersey, etc. But what makes this matter still more extraordinary in my eye is, that these very gentlemen, who were well apprised of the nakedness of the troops from ocular demonstration, who thought their own soldiers worse clad than others, and advised me near a month ago to postpone the execution of a plan I was about to adopt, in consequence of a resolve of Congress for seizing clothes, under strong assurances that an ample supply would be collected in 10 days, agreeably to a decree of the state, not one article of which, by the by, is yet to come to hand, should think a winter's campaign and the covering of their states from the invasion of an enemy so easy, practicable a business. I can assure those gentlemen that it is a much easier and less distressing thing to draw remonstrances in a comfortable room by a good fireside than to occupy a cold bleak hill, and sleep under frost and snow without clothes or blankets. However, although they seem to have little feeling for the naked and distressed soldiers, I feel superabundantly for them, and from my soul pity those miseries which it is not in my power either to relieve or to prevent. The representations made in this letter were not exaggerated. The distresses of the army, however, so far as respected clothing, did not arise from the inattention of Congress. Measures for the importation of clothes had been adopted early in the war, but had not produced the effect expected from them. Vigorous but ineffectual means had also been taken to obtain supplies from the interior. The unfortunate non-importation agreements which preceded the commencement of hostilities had reduced the quantity of goods in the country below the ordinary amount, and the war had almost annihilated foreign commerce. The progress of manufactures did not equal the consumption, and such was the real scarcity that exactions from individuals produced great distress without relieving the wants of the army. A warm blanket was a luxury in which not many participated, either in the camp or in the country. In the northern states, where the sea-coast was too extensive and the ports too numerous to be completely guarded, and where the people were more inclined to maritime enterprise, supplies both of arms and clothes were attainable in a more considerable degree than in those farther south, but the large sums of money expended in that part of the Union for the support of the army had lessened the value of the currency there more rapidly than elsewhere, and a consequent high nominal price was demanded for imported articles. Congress deemed the terms on which some large contracts had been made by the clothier general in Massachusetts so exorbitant as to forbid their execution, and at the same time addressed a letter to the state government requesting that the goods should be seized for the use of the army at prices to be fixed by the legislature in pursuance of a resolution of the 22nd of November. These recommendations from Congress, so far as they exhorted the states to supply the wants of the soldiers, were strongly supported by the general. In his letters to the several governors, he represented the very existence of the army and the continuance of the contest as depending on their exertions in this respect. 1778, General Washington's exertions to increase his force and to place it on a respectable footing before the ensuing campaign. To recruit the army for the ensuing campaign became again an object of vital importance, and the commander-in-chief again pressed its necessity on Congress and on the states. To obtain a respectable number of men by voluntary enlistment had obviously become impossible. Coercion could be employed only by the state governments, and it required all the influence of General Washington to induce the adoption of a measure so odious in itself, but so indispensable to the acquirement of means to meet the crisis of the war, which, in his judgment, had not yet passed away. He enclosed to each state a return of its troops on continental establishment, thereby exhibiting to each its own deficiency. To those who had not resorted to coercive means, he stated the success with which they had been used by others, and he urged all, by every motive which could operate on the human mind, to employ those means early enough to enable him to anticipate the enemy in taking the field. To the causes which had long threatened the destruction of the army, the depreciation of paper money was now to be added. It had become so considerable that the pay of an officer would not procure even those absolute necessaries which might protect his person from the extremes of heat and cold. The few who possessed small patrimonial estates found them melting away, and others were unable to appear as gentlemen. Such circumstances could not fail to excite disgust with the service and a disposition to leave it. Among those who offered their commissions to the commander-in-chief were many who, possessing a larger portion of military pride, and therefore feeling with peculiar sensibility the degradation connected with poverty and rags, afforded the fairest hopes of becoming the ornaments of the army. This general indifference about holding a commission, this general opinion that an obligation was conferred, not received by continuing in the service, could not fail to be unfavorable, not only to that spirit of emulation which stimulates to bolder deeds than are required, but to a complete execution of orders, and to a rigid observance of duty. An officer whose pride was in any degree wounded, whose caprice was not indulged, who apprehended censure for a fault which his carelessness about remaining in the army had probably seduced him to commit, was ready to throw up a commission which, instead of being valuable, was a burden almost too heavy to be borne. With extreme anxiety the commander-in-chief watched the progress of a temper which, though just commencing, would increase. He feared with the cause that produced it. He was therefore early and earnest in pressing the consideration of this important subject on the attention of Congress. January 10, Congress sent a committee of their own body to the army. The weak and broken condition of the Continental regiments, the strong remonstrances of the general, The numerous complaints received from every quarter determined Congress to depute a committee to reside in camp during the winter for the purpose of investigating the state of the army and reporting such reforms as the public good might require. This committee repaired to headquarters in the month of January. The commander-in-chief laid before them a general statement, taking a comprehensive view of the condition of the army and detailing the remedies necessary for the correction of existing abuses, as well as those regulations which he deemed essential to its future prosperity. This paper, exhibiting the actual state of the army, discloses defects of real magnitude in the existing arrangements. In perusing it, the reader is struck with the numerous difficulties, in addition to those resulting from inferiority of numbers, with which the American general was under the necessity of contending. The memorial is too long to be inserted, but there are parts which ought not to be entirely overlooked. The neglect of the very serious representation it contained respecting a future permanent provision for the officers threatened at an after period to be productive of such pernicious effects that their insertion in this place will not, it is presumed, be unacceptable. He recommended as the basis of every salutary reform a comfortable provision for the officers, which should render their commissions valuable, to effect which the future, as well as the present, ought to be contemplated. A long and continual sacrifice of individual interest for the general good ought not, he said, to be expected or required. The nature of man must be changed before institutions built on the presumptive truth of such a principle can succeed. This position, he added, is supported by the conduct of the officers of the American army, as well as by that of all other men. At the commencement of the dispute, in the first effusions of zeal, when it was believed the service would be temporary, they entered into it without regard to pecuniary considerations, but finding its duration much longer than had been at first expected, and that instead of deriving advantage from the hardships and dangers to which they are exposed, they were, on the contrary, losers by their patriotism, and fell far short of even a competency for their wants, they have gradually abated in their ardor, and with many an entire disinclination to the service, under present circumstances, has taken place. To this, in an eminent degree, must be ascribed the frequent resignations daily happening, and the more frequent importunities for permission to resign from some officers of the greatest merit. To this also may be ascribed the apathy, inattention, and neglect of duty which pervade all ranks, and which will necessarily continue and increase, while an officer, instead of gaining anything, is impoverished by his commission, and conceives he is conferring, not receiving a favor in holding it. There can be no sufficient tie on men possessing such sentiments, nor can any method be adopted to compel those to a punctual discharge of duty who are indifferent about their continuance in the service, and are often seeking a pretext to disengage themselves from it. Punishment in this case would be unavailing, but when an officer's commission is made valuable to him, and he fears to lose it, you may exact obedience from him. It is not indeed consistent with reason or justice that one set of men should make a sacrifice of property, domestic ease, and happiness, encounter the rigors of the field, the perils and vicissitudes of war, without some adequate compensation to obtain those blessings which every citizen will enjoy in common with them. It must also be a comfortless reflection to any man that after he may have contributed to secure the rights of his country at the risk of his life and the ruin of his fortune, there will be no provision made to prevent himself and his family from sinking into indigence and wretchedness. With these and other arguments, General Washington recommended, in addition to present compensation, a half-pay and pensionary establishment for the army. I urge my sentiments, said he, with the greater freedom, because I cannot and shall not receive the smallest benefit from the establishment, and can have no other inducement for proposing than a full conviction of its utility and propriety. The wants and distresses of the army, when actually seen by the committee of Congress, made a much deeper impression than could have been received from any statement whatever. They endeavored to communicate to Congress the sentiments felt by themselves, and to correct the errors which have been committed. But a numerous body, if it deliberate at all, proceeds slowly in the conduct of executive business, and will seldom afford a prompt corrective to existing mischiefs, especially to those growing out of its own measures. February 5. Much of the sufferings of the army was attributed to mismanagement in the quartermaster's department, which, notwithstanding the repeated remonstrances of the commander-in-chief, had long remained without a head. This subject was taken up early by the committee, and proper representations made respecting it, but Congress still remained under the influence of those opinions which had already produced such mischievous effects, and were still disposed to retain the subordinate officers of the department in a state of immediate dependence on their own body. In this temper, they proposed a plan which, not being approved in camp, was never carried into execution. While Congress was deliberating on the reforms proposed, the distresses of the army approached their acme, and its dissolution was threatened. Early in February, the commissaries gave notice that the country to a great distance was actually exhausted, and that it would be impracticable to obtain supplies for the army longer than to the end of that month. Already the threatened scarcity began to be felt, and the rations issued were often bad in quality and insufficient in quantity. General Washington found it necessary again to interpose his personal exertions to procure provisions from a distance. In the apprehension that the resources of the commissary department would fail before the distant supplies he had taken measures to obtain could reach him, and that the enemy designed to make another incursion into the country around Philadelphia for the purpose of gleaning what yet remained in possession of the inhabitants, he detached General Wayne with orders to seize every article proper for the use of an army within 15 miles of the Delaware, and to destroy the forage on the islands between Philadelphia and Chester. To defeat the objects of this foraging party, the inhabitants concealed their provisions and teams, and gave to the country every appearance of having been entirely pillaged. Before any sufficient aid could be obtained by these means, the bread as well as the meat was exhausted, and famine prevailed in camp. In an emergency so pressing, the commander-in-chief used every effort to feed his hungry army. Parties were sent out to glean the country. Officers of influence were deputed to Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland, and circular letters were addressed to the governors of states by the committees of Congress in camp and by the commander-in-chief, describing the wants of the army and urging the greatest exertions for its immediate relief. Fortunately for America, there were features in the character of Washington which, notwithstanding the discordant materials of which his army was composed, attached his officers and soldiers so strongly to his person that no distress could weaken their affection nor impair the respect and veneration in which they held him. To this sentiment is to be attributed in a great measure the preservation of a respectable military force under circumstances but too well calculated for its dissolution. Through this severe experiment on their fortitude, and the native Americans persevered steadily in the performance of their duty, but the conduct of the Europeans, who constituted a large part of the army, was to a considerable extent less laudable, and at no period of the war was desertion so frequent as during this winter. Aided by the disaffected, deserters eluded the vigilance of the parties who watched the roads, and great numbers escaped into Philadelphia with their arms. In a few days the army was rescued from the famine with which it had been threatened, and considerable supplies of provisions were laid up in camp. It was perceived that the difficulties which had produced such melancholy effects were created more by the want of due exertion in the commissary department and by the efforts of the people to save their stock for a better market than by any real deficiency of food in the country. This severe demonstration seems to have convinced Congress that their favorite system was radically vicious, and the subject was taken up with the serious intention of remodeling the commissary department on principles recommended by experience. But such were the delays inherent in the organization of that body that the new system was not adopted until late in April. In no period of the war had the situation of the American army been more perilous than at Valley Forge. Even when the troops were not entirely destitute of food, their stock of provisions was so scanty that a quantity sufficient for 1 week was seldom in store. Consequently, had General Howe moved out in force, the American army could not have remained in camp, and their want of clothes disabled them from keeping the field in the winter. The returns of the 1st of February exhibit the astonishing number of 3,989 men in camp, unfit for duty for want of clothes. Scarcely one man of these had a pair of shoes. Even among those returned capable of doing duty, many were so badly clad that exposure to the cold of the season must have destroyed them. Although the total of the army exceeded 17,000 men, the present effective rank and file amounted to only 5,012. While the sufferings of the soldiers filled the hospitals, a dreadful mortality continued to prevail in those miserable receptacles of the sick. A violent putrid fever swept off much greater numbers than all the diseases of the camp. If then, during the deep snow which covered the earth for a great part of the winter, the British general had taken the field, his own army would indeed have suffered greatly, but the American loss is not to be calculated. Washington's headquarters at Valley Forge, here on December 17, 1777, after the battles of Brandywine and Germantown and the occupation of Philadelphia by the British, Washington established his headquarters for what may be paradoxically termed the darkest winter of the Revolutionary War. The American commander-in-chief chose this place partly for its defensibility and partly to protect Congress then in session at York, Pennsylvania. from a sudden British attack. It was here that Washington and Baron Steuben planned the reorganization of the American army, and it was here, May 1, 1778, that news reached Washington of the consummation of the French alliance. End of chapter 11, part 1. Chapter 11, part 2 of the Life of Washington, volume 2, by John Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, part 2. Attempt to surprise Captain Lee's corps and the gallant resistance made by him, March 28. Happily, the real condition of Washington was not well understood by Sir William Howe, and the characteristic attention of that officer to the lives and comfort of his troops saved the American army. Fortunately, he confined his operations to those small excursions that were calculated to enlarge the comforts of his own soldiers, who, notwithstanding the favorable dispositions of the neighboring country, were much distressed for fuel, and often in great want of forage and fresh provisions. The vigilance of the parties on the lines, especially on the south side of the Schuylkill, intercepted a large portion of the supplies intended for the Philadelphia market, and corporal punishment was frequently inflicted on those who were detected in attempting this infraction of the laws. As Captain Lee was particularly active, a plan was formed late in January to surprise and capture him in his quarters. An extensive circuit was made by a large body of cavalry, who seized 4 of his patrols without communicating an alarm. About break of day the British horse appeared, upon which Captain Lee placed his troopers that were in the house at the doors and windows, who behaved so gallantly as to repulse the assailants without losing a horse or man. Only Lieutenant Lindsay and 1 private were wounded. The whole number in the house did not exceed 10. That of the assailants was said to amount to 200. They lost a sergeant and 3 men with several horses killed, and an officer and 3 men wounded. The result of this skirmish gave great pleasure to the commander-in-chief, who had formed a high opinion of Lee's talents as a partisan. He mentioned the affair in his orders with strong marks of approbation, and in a private letter to the captain testified the satisfaction he felt for his merit through the preceding campaign. Congress promoted him to the rank of major and gave him an independent partisan corps to consist of 3 troops of horse. Congress determined upon a second expedition against Canada. While the deficiency of the public resources arising from the alarming depreciation of the bills of credit manifested itself in all the military departments, a plan was matured in Congress and in the Board of War without consulting the commander-in-chief for a second irruption into Canada. It was proposed to place the Marquis de Lafayette at the head of this expedition, and to employ Generals Conway and Stark as the second and third in command. This young nobleman, possessing an excellent heart and all the military enthusiasm of his country, had left France early in 1777 in opposition to the will of his sovereign to engage in the service of the United States. His high rank and supposed influence at the court of Versailles secured him the unlimited respect of his countrymen in America, and added to his frankness of manners and zeal in their cause, recommended him strongly to Congress. While the claims of others of the same country to rank were too exorbitant to be gratified, he demanded no station in the army, would consent to receive no compensation, and offered to serve as a volunteer. He had stipulated with Mr. Dean for the rank of Major General without emolument, and on his arrival in America that rank was conferred on him, but without any immediate command. In that capacity he sought for danger, and was wounded at the Battle of Brandywine. He attached himself with the ardor of youth to the commander-in-chief, who smoothed the way to his receiving a command in the army equal to his rank. The first intimation to General Washington that the expedition was contemplated was given in a letter from the President of the Board of War of the 24th of January, enclosing one of the same date to the Marquis, requiring the attendance of that nobleman on Congress to receive his instructions. The commander-in-chief was requested to furnish Colonel Hazen's regiment, chiefly composed of Canadians, for the expedition, and in the same letter his advice and opinion were asked respecting it. The Northern States were to furnish the necessary troops. Without noticing the manner in which this business had been conducted and the marked want of confidence it betrayed, General Washington ordered Hazen's regiment to march towards Albany, and the Marquis proceeded immediately to the seat of Congress. At his request he was to be considered as an officer detached from the army of Washington, to remain under his orders, and Major General the Baron de Kalb was added to the expedition, after which the Marquis repaired in person to Albany to take charge of the troops who were to assemble at that place in order to cross the lakes on the ice and attack Montreal. Before its execution it is abandoned. On arriving at Albany he found no preparations made for the expedition. Nothing which he had been promised being in readiness, he abandoned the enterprise as impracticable. Some time afterward, Congress also determined to relinquish it, and General Washington was authorized to recall both the Marquis de Lafayette and the Baron de Kalb. February 27, while the army lay at Valley Forge, the Baron Steuben arrived in camp. This gentleman was a Prussian officer who came to the United States with ample recommendations. He was said to have served many years in the armies of the great Frederick, to have been one of the aides de camp of that consummate commander, and to have held the rank of lieutenant general. He was unquestionably versed in the system of field exercise which the King of Prussia had introduced, and was well qualified to teach it to raw troops. He claimed no rank and offered to render his services as a volunteer. After holding a conference with Congress, he proceeded to Valley Forge. General Conway resigns. Duel between him and General Cadwalader. Although the office of Inspector General had been bestowed on Conway, he had never entered on its duties, and his promotion to the rank of Major General had given much umbrage to the brigadiers who had been his seniors. That circumstance, in addition to the knowledge of his being in a faction hostile to the commander-in-chief, rendered his situation in the army so uncomfortable that he withdrew to York, in Pennsylvania, which was then the seat of Congress. When the expedition to Canada was abandoned, he was not directed with Lafayette and de Kalb to rejoin the army. Entertaining no hope of being permitted to exercise the functions of his new office, he resigned his commission about the last of April, and some time afterwards returned to France. The Baron Steuben appointed Inspector General. On his resignation, the Baron Steuben, who had as a volunteer performed the duties of Inspector General, much to the satisfaction of the Commander-in-Chief and of the army, was, on the recommendation of General Washington, appointed to that office with the rank of Major General without exciting the slightest murmur. This gentleman was of real service to the American troops. He established one uniform system of field exercise, and by his skill and persevering industry effected important improvements through all ranks of the army during its continuance at Valley Forge. 1777. While it was encamped at this place, several matters of great interest engaged the attention of Congress. Among them was the stipulation in the Convention of Saratoga for the return of the British army to England. Boston was named as the place of embarkation. At the time of the capitulation, the difficulty of making that port early in the winter was unknown to General Burgoyne. Consequently, as some time must elapse before a sufficient number of vessels for the transportation of his army could be collected, its embarkation might be delayed until the ensuing spring. November 25, on receiving this unwelcome intelligence, he applied to General Washington to change the port of embarkation and to substitute Newport in Rhode Island, or some place on the Sound for Boston. If any considerations not foreseen should make this proposal objectionable, he then solicited this indulgence for himself and his suite. This request was communicated to Congress in terms favorable to that part of the application which respected General Burgoyne and his suite, but objections to any change in the convention, which might expedite the transportation of the army, were too weighty to be disregarded, and the general pressed them earnestly on Congress. This precaution was unnecessary. The facility with which the convention might be violated by the British and the captured army be united to that under General Howe seems to have suggested itself to the American government as soon as the first rejoicings were over, and such was its then existing temper that the faith and honor of British officers were believed to be no securities against their appearing again in the field. Under this impression, a resolution had passed early in November, directing General Heath to transmit to the Board of War a descriptive list of all persons comprehended in the convention, in order that if any officer, soldier, or other person of the said army should hereafter be found in arms against these states in North America during the present contest, he might be convicted of the offense and suffer the punishment in such case inflicted by the law of nations. No other notice was taken of the application made by General Burgoyne to Congress through the Commander-in-Chief than to pass a resolution that General Washington be directed to inform General Burgoyne that Congress will not receive nor consider any proposition for indulgence, nor for altering the terms of the Convention of Saratoga, unless immediately directed to their own body. December, contrary to expectation, a fleet of transports for the reception of the troops reached Rhode Island on its way to Boston in the month of December. But before its arrival, the preconceived suspicions of Congress had ripened into conviction. Several circumstances combined to produce this result. General Burgoyne, dissatisfied with the accommodations prepared for his officers in Boston, had, after a fruitless correspondence with General Heath, addressed a letter to General Gates, in which he complained of the inconvenient quarters assigned his officers as a breach of the articles of the convention. This complaint was considered by Congress as being made for the purpose of letting in the principle that the breach of one article of a treaty discharges the injured party from its obligations. This suspicion was strengthened by the indiscreet hesitation of General Burgoyne to permit the resolution requiring a descriptive list of his troops to be executed. His subsequent relinquishment of the objection did not remove the impression it had made. It was also alleged that the number of transports was not sufficient to convey the troops to Europe, nor was it believed possible that Sir William Howe could have laid in so expeditiously a sufficient stock of provisions for the voyage. These objections to the embarkation of Burgoyne's troops were strengthened by some trivial infractions of the convention, which it was contended gave Congress a strict right to detain them. It was stipulated that the arms should be delivered up, and it appeared that several cartouche boxes and other military accoutrements, supposed to be comprehended in the technical term arms, had been detained. This was deemed an infraction of the letter of the compact, which on rigid principle justified the measures afterwards adopted by Congress. Congress forbid the embarkation of the British troops taken at Saratoga. The whole subject was referred to a committee, who reported all the circumstances of the case, whereupon Congress came to several resolutions enumerating the facts already mentioned, the last of which was in these words: Resolved, therefore, that the embarkation of Lieutenant General Burgoyne and the troops under his command be suspended until a distinct and explicit ratification of the Convention of Saratoga shall be properly notified by the Court of Great Britain to Congress. These resolutions, together with the report on which they were founded, were transmitted to the several states and to General Washington. 2 copies of them were sent to General Heath, with direction to deliver one of them to General Burgoyne, and with farther directions to order the vessels which may have arrived, or which shall arrive for the transportation of the army under Lieutenant General Burgoyne, to quit without delay the port of Boston. Burgoyne permitted to depart. On receiving these resolutions, General Burgoyne addressed a letter to Congress containing papers on which he founded a defense of his conduct, and insisted on the embarkation of his army as stipulated in the convention. But the committee to whom these papers were referred reported their opinion, after the most attentive consideration of them, to be that nothing therein contained was sufficient to induce Congress to recede from their resolves of the 8th of January last respecting the Convention of Saratoga. This application was accompanied by another letter from General Burgoyne, to be delivered if the army should still be detained, in which, in consideration of the state of his health, he solicited permission to return to England. This request was readily granted. The impression made on the British nation by the capitulation of Burgoyne, notwithstanding the persevering temper of the king, at length made its way into the cabinet, and produced resolutions in favor of pacific measures. 1778, February, after the rejection of repeated motions made by the opposition members tending to the abandonment of the American war, Lord North gave notice in the House of Commons that he had digested a plan of reconciliation, which he designed shortly to lay before the House. Plan of reconciliation with America agreed to in Parliament. In conformity with this notice, he moved for leave to bring in, first, a bill for removing all doubts and apprehensions concerning taxation by the Parliament of Great Britain in any of the colonies and plantations of North America. Second, a bill to enable His Majesty to appoint commissioners with sufficient powers to treat, consult, and agree upon the means of quieting the disorders now subsisting in certain of the colonies of North America. The first contained a declaration that Parliament will impose no tax or duty, whatever payable within any of the colonies of North America, except only such duties as may be expedient to impose for the purposes of commerce, the net produce of which should always be paid and applied to and for the use of the colonies in which the same shall be respectively levied, in like manner as other duties collected under the authority of their respective legislatures are ordinarily paid and applied. The second authorized the appointment of commissioners by the Crown with power to treat either with the existing governments or with individuals in America, provided that no stipulations which might be entered into should have any effect until approved in Parliament, other than is afterward mentioned. It is then enacted that the commissioners may have power to proclaim a cessation of hostilities in any of the colonies, to suspend the operation of the non-intercourse law, and farther to suspend during the continuance of the act so much of all or any of the acts of Parliament which have passed since the 10th day of February 1763 as relates to the colonies, to grant pardon to any number or description of persons, and to appoint a governor in any colony in which His Majesty had heretofore exercised the power of making such appointments. These bills passed both houses of Parliament within considerable opposition. Intelligence of the treaty between the United States and France having been received by the minister about the time of their being introduced, copies of them, before they had gone through the requisite forms, were hurried to America, to be laid before Congress and the public, in the hope and expectation that they might counteract the effects which it was feared the treaty with France would produce. April, General Washington received early information of their arrival, and entertained serious fears of their operation. He was apprehensive that the publication of a proposition for the restoration of peace on the terms originally required by America would greatly increase the numbers of the disaffected, and immediately forwarded the bills to Congress in a letter suggesting the policy of preventing their pernicious influence on the public mind by all possible means, and especially through the medium of the press. Communicated to and rejected by Congress, April 22. This letter was referred to a committee consisting of Messrs. Morris, Drayton, and Dana, by whom a report was made investigating the bills with great acuteness as well as asperity. This report and the resolutions upon it were ordered to be published. Other resolutions were passed the succeeding day, recommending it to the states to pardon under such limitations as they might think proper to make such of their misguided fellow citizens as had levied war against the United States. This resolution was accompanied by an order directing it to be printed in English and in German, and requesting General Washington to take such measures as he should deem most effectual for circulating the copies among the American recruits in the enemy's army. During these transactions, the frigate La Sensible arrived with the important intelligence that treaties of alliance and of commerce had been formed between the United States of America and France. The treaties themselves were brought by Mr. Simeon Dean, the brother of the American minister in Paris. This event had long been anxiously expected, and the delay attending it had been such as to excite serious apprehension that it would never take place. France was still extremely sore under the wounds inflicted during the war which terminated in 1763. It was impossible to reflect on a treaty which had wrested from her so fair a part of North America without feeling resentments which would seek the first occasion of gratification. The growing discontents between Great Britain and her colonies were consequently viewed at a distance with secret satisfaction, but rather as a circumstance which might have some tendency to weaken and embarrass a rival, and which was to be encouraged from motives of general policy than as one from which any definite advantage was to be derived. France appears at that time to have required and wished for repose. The great exertions of the preceding disastrous war had so deranged her finances that the wish to preserve peace seems to have predominated in her cabinet. The young monarch, who had just ascended the throne, possessed a pacific, unambitious temper, and the councils of the nation were governed by men alike indisposed to disturb the general tranquillity. The advice they gave the monarch was to aid and encourage the colonies secretly, in order to prevent a reconciliation with the mother country, and to prepare privately for hostilities by improving his finances and strengthening his marine, but to avoid everything which might give occasion for open war. The system which for time regulated the cabinet of Versailles conformed to this advice, while the utmost attention was paid to the minister Britain, and every measure to satisfy him was openly taken. Intimation was privately given to those of the United States that these measures were necessary for the present, but they might be assured of the goodwill of the French government. During the public demonstration of dispositions favorable to England, means were taken to furnish aids of ammunition and arms, and to facilitate the negotiation of loans to the United States, and the owners of American privateers, though forbidden to sell their prizes or to procure their condemnation, and found means to dispose of them privately. Meanwhile, another party was formed in the cabinet, to whose political system subsequent events gave the ascendancy. Its avowed object was to seize the present moment, to revenge past injuries, humble the haughty rival of France, and dismember her empire. Matters remained in a fluctuating state until December 1777, privately encouraged but discountenanced publicly the prospects of the American ministers, according to the complexion of American affairs. Intelligence of the Convention of Saratoga reached France early in December 1777. The American deputies took that opportunity to press the treaty which had been under consideration for the preceding 12 months, and to urge the importance at this juncture, when Britain would most probably make proposals for an accommodation, of communicating to Congress precisely what was to be expected from France and Spain. They were informed by M. Girard, one of the secretaries of the King's Council of State, that it was determined to acknowledge the independence of the United States and to make a treaty with them; that His Most Christian Majesty was resolved not only to acknowledge but to support their independence; that in doing this he might probably soon be engaged in a war, yet he should not expect any compensation from the United States on that account, nor was it pretended that he acted wholly for their sakes, since besides his real goodwill to them, it was manifestly the interest of France that the power of England should be diminished by the separation of her colonies. The only condition he should require would be that the United States, in no peace to be made, should give up their independence and return to their obedience to the British government. On determining to take this decisive course, the cabinet of Versailles had dispatched a courier to His Catholic Majesty with information of the line of conduct about to be pursued by France. On his return, the negotiation was taken up in earnest, and a treaty of friendship and commerce was soon concluded. This was accompanied by a treaty of alliance, eventual and defensive, between the two nations, in which it was declared that if war should break out between France and England during the existence of that with the United States, it should be made a common cause, and that neither of the contracting parties should conclude either truce or peace with Great Britain without the formal consent of the other first obtained. And they mutually engaged not to lay down their arms until the independence of the United States shall have been formally or tacitly assured by the treaty or treaties that shall terminate the war. It was the wish of the ministers of the United States to engage France immediately in the war and to make the alliance not eventual but positive. This proposition, however, was rejected. In a few weeks after the conclusion of these negotiations, the Marquis de Noailles announced officially to the Court of London the treaty of friendship and commerce France had formed with the United States. The British government, considering this notification as a declaration of war, published a memorial for the purpose of justifying to all Europe the hostilities it had determined to commence. Soon after their commencement, the Count de Vergennes received private intelligence that it was contemplated in the cabinet of London to offer to the United States an acknowledgment of their independence as the condition of a separate peace. He immediately communicated this intelligence to the American ministers, requesting them to lose no time in stating to Congress that though war was not declared in form, it had commenced in fact, and that he considered the obligations of the Treaty of Alliance as in full force. Consequently, that neither party was now at liberty to make a separate peace. Instructions of a similar import were given to the minister of France in the United States. Information received of treaties of alliance and commerce being entered into between France and the United States. The dispatches containing these treaties were received by the President on Saturday, the 2nd of May, after Congress had adjourned. That body was immediately convened. The dispatches were opened and their joyful contents communicated. In the exaltation of the moment, the treaty of alliance, as well as that of commerce and friendship, was published, a circumstance which, not without reason, gave umbrage to the cabinet of Versailles, because that treaty, being only eventual, ought not to have been communicated to the public but by mutual consent. From this event, which was the source of universal exultation to the friends of the Revolution, the attention must be directed to one which was productive of very different sensations. Among the various improvements which struggling humanity had gradually engrafted on the belligerent code, none have contributed more to diminish the calamities of war than those which meliorate the condition of prisoners. No obligations will be more respected by the generous and the brave, nor are there any the violation of which could wound the national character more deeply or expose it to more lasting or better merited reproach. In wars between nations nearly equal in power and possessing rights acknowledged to be equal, a departure from modern usage in this respect is almost unknown, and the voice of the civilized world would be raised against the potentate who could adopt a system calculated to reestablish the rigors and misery of exploded barbarism. But in contests between different parts of the same empire, those practices which mitigate the horrors of war yield too frequently to the calculations of a blind and erring resentment. The party which supports the ancient state of things often treats resistance as rebellion and captives as traitors. The opposite party, supporting also by the sword principles believed to be right, will admit of no departure from established usage to its prejudice, and may be expected, if possessing the power, to endeavor by retaliating injuries to compel the observance of a more just and humane system, but they participate in the fault imputable to their adversaries by manifesting a disposition to punish those whom they deem traitors with the same severity of which they so loudly and justly complain when they are themselves its victims. General Gage, as commander-in-chief of the British Army, in the harshness of spirit which had been excited while governor of Massachusetts, not only threw all his prisoners into a common jail, but rejected every proposition for an exchange of them. When the command devolved on Sir William Howe, this absurd system was abandoned, and an exchange took place to a considerable extent, but the Americans had not made a sufficient number of prisoners to relieve all their citizens. Many of them still remained in confinement. Representations were continually received from these unfortunate men, describing in strong terms the severity of their treatment. They complained of suffering almost the extremity of famine, that even the supply of provisions allowed them was unsound, and that they were crowded into prison ships, where they became the victims of disease. When charged with conduct so unworthy of his character and station, Sir William Howe positively denied the truth. It would be unjust to ascribe this excess of inhumanity to an officer who, though perhaps severe in his temper, did not mingle cruelties in his general system, which would excite universal indignation in other wars. It must be admitted that his supplies of provisions were neither good nor abundant, and that the American soldiers in their own camp were unhealthy, but the excessive mortality prevailing among the prisoners can be accounted for on no ordinary principles, and the candid, who were least inclined to criminate without cause, have ever been persuaded that if his orders did not produce the distress which existed, his authority was not interposed with sufficient energy to correct the abuses which prevailed. The capture of General Lee furnished an additional ground of controversy on the subject of prisoners, as he had been an officer in the British service whose resignation had not, perhaps, been received when he entered into that of America. A disposition was at first manifested to consider him as a deserter, and he was closely confined. On receiving information of this circumstance, Congress directed General Howe to be assured that Lieutenant Colonel Campbell and 5 Hessian field officers should be detained and should experience precisely the fate of General Lee. These officers were taken into close custody and informed that the resolution announced to General Howe should be strictly enforced. The sentiments of the commander-in-chief on the subject of retaliation seem to have been less severe than those of Congress. So great was his abhorrence of the cruelties such a practice must generate, that he was unwilling to adopt it in any case, not of absolute and apparent necessity. Not believing that of General Lee to be such a case, he remonstrated strongly against these resolutions. But Congress remained inflexible, and the officers designated as the objects of retaliation were kept in rigorous confinement until General Lee was declared to be a prisoner of war. The resolutions of Congress respecting the prisoners taken at the Cedars were also the source of much embarrassment and chagrin to the commander-in-chief, alleging that the capitulation had been violated on the part of the enemy, and that the savages had been permitted to murder some of the prisoners and to plunder others. They withheld their sanction from the agreement entered into by General Arnold with Captain Forster, and refused to allow other prisoners to be returned in exchange for those liberated under that agreement, until the murderers should be given up and compensation made for the baggage said to have been plundered. As the fact alleged was not clearly established, Sir William Howe continued to press General Washington on this subject, reminding him of the importance of a punctilious observance of faith plighted in engagements like that made by General Arnold. He persisted to hold the commander-in-chief personally bound for an honorable compliance with military stipulations entered into by an officer under his authority. General Washington, feeling the keenness of the reproach, pressed Congress to change their resolution on this subject, but his remonstrances were for a long time unavailing. After the sufferings of the prisoners in New York had been extreme, and great numbers had perished in confinement, the survivors were liberated for the purpose of being exchanged. But so miserable was their condition that many of them died on their way home. For the dead as well as the living, General Howe claimed a return of prisoners, while General Washington contended that reasonable deductions should be made for those who were actually dead of diseases under which they labored when permitted to leave the British prisons. Until this claim should be admitted, General Howe rejected any partial exchange. General Washington was immovable in his determination to repel it, and thus all hope of being relieved in the ordinary mode appeared to be taken from those whom the fortune of war had placed in the power of the enemy. Complaints made by General Washington of the treatment of American prisoners in possession of the enemy. In the meantime, the sufferings of the American prisoners increased with the increasing severity of the season. Information continued to be received that they suffered almost the extremity of famine. Repeated remonstrances made on this subject to the British general were answered by a denial of the fact. He continued to aver that the same food, both in quantity and quality, was issued to the prisoners as to British troops when in transports or elsewhere not on actual duty, and that every tenderness was extended to them which was compatible with the situation of his army. He yielded to the request made by General Washington to permit a commissary to visit the jails, and demanded passports for an agent to administer to the wants of British prisoners. When Mr. Boudinot, the American commissary of prisoners, who was appointed by General Washington to visit the jails in Philadelphia, met Mr. Ferguson, the British commissary, he was informed that General Howe thought it unnecessary for him to come into the city, as he would himself inspect the situation and treatment of the prisoners. There is reason to believe that their causes of complaint, so far as respected provisions, did not exist afterwards in the same degree as formerly, and that the strong measures subsequently taken by Congress were founded on facts of an earlier date. But clothes and blankets were also necessary, and the difficulty of furnishing them was considerable. General Howe would not permit the purchase of those articles in Philadelphia, and they were not attainable elsewhere. Proceedings of Congress on this subject, to compel them to abandon this distressing restriction, and to permit the use of paper money within the British lines, Congress resolved that no prisoner should be exchanged until all the expenditures made in paper for the supplies they received from the United States should be repaid in specie at the rate of 4 shillings and 6 for each dollar. They afterwards determined that from the first day of February no British commissary should be permitted to purchase any provisions for the use of prisoners west of New Jersey, but that all supplies for persons of that description should be furnished from British stores. Sir William Howe remonstrated against the last resolution with great strength and justice, as a decree which doomed a considerable number of prisoners far removed into the country to a slow and painful death by famine, since it was impracticable to supply them immediately from Philadelphia. The severity of this order was in some degree mitigated by a resolution that each British commissary of prisoners should receive provisions from the American commissary purchases to be paid for in specie according to the resolution of the 19th of December, 1777. About the same time an order was hastily given by the Board of War, which produced no inconsiderable degree of embarrassment and exposed the commander-in-chief to strictures not less severe than those he had applied to the British general. General Washington had consented that a quartermaster with a small escort should come out of Philadelphia with clothes and other comforts for the prisoners who were in possession of the United States. He had expressly stipulated for their security and had given them a passport. January 26, while they were traveling through the country, information was given to the Board of War that General Howe had refused to permit provisions to be sent in to the American prisoners in Philadelphia by water. This information was not correct. General Howe had only requested that flags should not be sent up or down the river without previous permission obtained from himself. On this information, however, the board ordered Lieutenant Colonel Smith immediately to seize the officers, though protected by the passport of General Washington, their horses, carriages, and the provisions destined for the relief of the British prisoners, and to secure them until farther orders, either from the board or from the commander-in-chief. General Washington, on hearing this circumstance, dispatched one of his aides with orders for the immediate release of the persons and property which had been confined, but the officers refused to proceed on their journey and returned to Philadelphia. This untoward event was much regretted by the commander-in-chief. In a letter received some time afterwards, General Howe, after expressing his willingness that the American prisoners should be visited by deputy commissaries, who should inspect their situation and supply their wants required as the condition on which this indulgence should be granted, but a similar permit should be allowed to persons appointed by him, which should be accompanied with the assurance of General Washington that his authority will have sufficient weight to prevent any interruption to their progress and any insult to their persons. This demand was ascribed to the treatment to which officers under the protection of his passport had already been exposed. General Washington lamented the impediment to the exchange of prisoners which had hitherto appeared to be insuperable, and made repeated but ineffectual efforts to remove it. General Howe had uniformly refused to proceed with any cartel unless his right to claim for all the diseased and infirm whom he had liberated should be previously admitted. At length, after all hope of inducing him to recede from that high ground had been abandoned, he suddenly relinquished it of his own accord and acceded completely to the proposition of General Washington for the meeting of commissioners in order to settle equitably the number to which he should be entitled for those he had discharged in the preceding winter. This point being adjusted, commissaries were mutually appointed, who were to meet on the 10th of March in Germantown to arrange the details of a general cartel. March 4, the commander-in-chief had entertained no doubt of his authority to enter into this agreement. On the 4th of March, however, he had the mortification to perceive in a newspaper a resolution of Congress calling on the several states for the amounts of supplies furnished the prisoners, that they might be adjusted according to the rule of the 10th of December before the exchange should take place. On seeing this embarrassing resolution, General Washington addressed a letter to Sir William Howe, informing him that particular circumstances had rendered it inconvenient for the American commissioners to attend at the time appointed, and requesting that their meeting should be deferred from the 10th to the 21st of March. The interval was successfully employed in obtaining a repeal of the resolution. It would seem probable that the dispositions of Congress on the subject of an exchange did not correspond with those of General Washington. From the fundamental principle of the military establishment of the United States at its commencement, an exchange of prisoners would necessarily strengthen the British much more than the American army. The war having been carried on by troops raised for short times, aided by militia, the American prisoners, when exchanged, returned to their homes as citizens, while those of the enemy again took the field. General Washington, who was governed by a policy more just and more permanently beneficial, addressed himself seriously to Congress, urging as well the injury done the public faith and his own personal honor by this infraction of a solemn engagement as the cruelty and impolicy of a system which must cut off forever all hopes of an exchange and render imprisonment as lasting as the war. He represented in strong terms the effect such a measure must have on the troops on whom they should thereafter be compelled chiefly to rely, and its impression on the friends of those already in captivity. These remonstrances produced the desired effect, and the resolutions were repealed. The commissioners met according to the second appointment, but on examining their powers, it appeared that those given by General Washington were expressed to be in virtue of the authority vested in him, while those given by Sir William Howe contained no such declaration. This omission produced an objection on the part of the United States, but General Howe refused to change the language, alleging that he designed the treaty to be of a personal nature, founded on the mutual confidence and honor of the contracting generals, and had no intention either to bind his government or to extend the cartel beyond the limits and duration of his own command. This explanation being unsatisfactory to the American commissioners, and General Howe persisting in his refusal to make the required alteration in his powers, the negotiation was broken off, and this fair prospect of terminating the distresses of numerous unfortunate persons passed away without effecting the good it had promised. Sometime after the failure of this negotiation for a general cartel, Sir William Howe proposed that all prisoners actually exchangeable should be sent in to the nearest posts, and returns made of officer for officer of equal rank and soldier for soldier as far as numbers would admit, and that if a surplus of officers should remain, they should be exchanged for an equivalent in privates. A partial exchange agreed to. On the representations of General Washington, Congress acceded to this proposition so far as related to the exchange of officer for officer and soldier for soldier, but rejected the part which admitted an equivalent in privates for a surplus of officers, because the officers captured with Burgoyne were exchangeable within the powers of General Howe. Under this agreement, an exchange took place to a considerable extent, but as the Americans had lost more prisoners than they had taken, unless the army of Burgoyne should be brought into computation, many of their troops were still detained in captivity. End of Chapter 11, Part 2. End of The Life of Washington, Volume 2, by John Marshall.